you ready? Okay. Our meeting will come to order. I see our witnesses are already taking their positions. Appreciate that very much. We always start on time. Jack and I have this understanding, and it has great effects. The committee meets today to receive testimonies from the service secretaries and service chiefs of our nation's military. At the end of December, I heard from families about the dismal conditions they faced in privatized housing in Oklahoma and then around the country. You know, I was here 20 years ago when that decision was made, and I remember the discussion at that time. You know, it's going to work for a while, then you wait 20 years from now and see what problems erupt, and it happened. Since the time, this committee has acted quickly. We held a hearing where we heard heart-wrenching testimony from family members, privatized housing partners, and military leadership. One of those was Jana Driver, who's back there in the front row of the second section. And I just told her how much I appreciated the fact that she drew this to my attention. Her husband's at Tinker Air Force Base, and you can always be more sensitive to and understanding of when you hear problems emanating from someone who's personally experienced it. Senator Reid and I sent our staff to a number of military installations, including Fort Bragg, Norfolk Joint Base, Anacostia, Tinker Air Force Base, and then the others came from the services who actually went to every one of, and I've talked to many of you who have been to every one of the installations in your command, certainly the Army. So you've never seen government working as fast as it's worked in the last 3 weeks. I'd like to read you a portion of the trip summary that the staff wrote, which I will note was shared with each of our witnesses. Now, I'm quoting now, and this is for the benefit of not just the witnesses here or this table, but those in the back of the room, which we'll recognize in a moment. Quote, from both home inspections and sensing sessions conducted with current on-base residents, the systemic issues outlined at the recent SASC hearing are not only substantiated, but we believe the problems may be much worse. Installation commanders had different opinions of their housing inventory before and after we conducted our tours, where they thought they had a good understanding of current housing conditions. Most came away embarrassed that they were not aware of some of the dire situations. Specific issues included absolutely no quality assurance from the services, which the chain of command admits is a problem. Primary partners in subcontractor maintenance performing shoddy patchwork instead of remediating the cause of the problem, and extreme frustration with the resident energy conservation program, which is supposed to curb the energy usage for on-base. Now, this is where the summary ends, but this is where the tough questions must begin. You know, how did we get to this point where the chain of command felt that they were not empowered, expected, or morally obligated to help? This is something different. I can remember my chain of command when I was a private in the United States Army. That was it. There was nobody questioning about it. And that's somehow changed, and perhaps this is going to help us in changing back something that should not have been changed. What actions have you taken since that hearing? Why didn't you know about this and fix it before Congress had to step in? Who is responsible and who is being held accountable? Finally, what can we do now to make this right for our families? I have asked the chain of command from each of the services here today, because of the health, safety, and welfare of our service members are the responsibility to everyone from the secretary to the squad leaders, plain and simple. The chain of command failed to take care of its own and lost their trust. Now the chain of command must regain that trust. But the contractor must bear an equal or greater share of this responsibility. By no means will we bail the contractors out and pass that along the cost to the taxpayer. That's not going to happen. They agreed to take care of our families, and in fact, by their own admission, these contractors have not. In closing, we always say, recruit the service member, retain the family. But if we lose the trust of the military families, we risk losing the next generation of service members, which could be a very serious problem to the safety of this country. With that, I would like to recognize any of our military families who are here today. We're going to ask you to stand up. I know where you're seated. Stand up if you're a family of a military. Okay, let's give them a hand. Let me summarize what our feelings are now with you. Help is on its way. To our service secretaries and chiefs, these people represent the thousands of military families whose trust you must regain. Before I turn to Senator Reid, I'd like to ask the members to stay on topic. We are here to get answers for our families, and our witnesses will be back in the coming weeks to answer questions and so forth. But what we're going to do on this is something we have not done in quite a while. And that is, we're going to have, instead of a 5-minute question, we're going to have 7-minute question. But we're going to use the gavel. To all of you who might be tempted to go over that, we're not going to let you do that. I don't mind being unpopular this day, and maybe you'll forget it tomorrow. After Senator Reid for opening statement.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd also.
Let me interrupt you first. I'm afraid we might lose a quorum. Since a quorum is now present, I ask the committee to consider nomination of William Bookless to be Principal Deputy Administrator, National Nuclear Security Administration, Veronica Daigle to be Assistant Secretary of Defense for Readiness and Force Management, Tom McCraffey to be Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs, and Lisa Chinek to be Judge of the U.S. Court of Military Commission. Is there a motion to favor?
So moved.
A second. All in favor say aye. Aye. Ayes have it. It is now done. I apologize, Senator Reid.
Quite all right, sir. Let me thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank the service secretaries and the chiefs for being here today. In the 3 weeks since our last hearing on military privatized housing, it has become clear that there are systematic failures on the part of both the private housing companies and the Department of Defense. While the horrific conditions vary by installation, ranging from lead-based paint, mold, and rodents, the underlying causes and fundamental breakdowns are unfortunately all too common across the country. And these housing problems are exacerbated by the fact that military families frequently move every few years and is reinforced by a culture of enduring hardships rather than speaking of them, for fear of retaliation, among other reasons. For far too long, privatized housing companies have been allowed to deliver lackluster customer service to military families, conduct and bare minimum for routine maintenance, and exercise zero quality control, while accruing sizable profits. Unfortunately, all this has been able to occur because of a lack of accountability by the Department of Defense. I want to give just one example. A Navy family had squirrels enter their attic through a hole in the roof. Soon after, the squirrels died and maggots dropped through their ceiling fan onto their bed. The housing company showed up to remove the squirrels but failed to seal the hole in the roof for the last year. We know this because committee staff visited them 2 weeks ago. Furthermore, over the last 2.5 years, workers from the housing company visited this same home 52 times for instances of water intrusion and inadequate follow-on work orders. 52 times without ever bothering to examine the root cause of the problem. On top of all this, the housing company still charges his family $1,780 per month in BAH. I guarantee no one in this room would ever put up with the substandard living conditions some of these military families have had to endure. I'm eager to hear what solutions the military service will propose today. I have several thoughts. First, I believe that the services have lost sight of the important philosophy of taking care of uniformed personnel and their families in all aspects of life, whether it is the professional readiness of the warfighter or the fact that he or she arrives home, on post or off post each night to a flooded basement, black mold on the wall. I want to know how each of you intend to instill that obligation in your commanders. Second, military families must feel empowered with a standard Bill of Rights across the military services. Families deserve the flexibility to withhold their BAH in the event of a housing problem that is not adequately resolved in a timely fashion. I understand some of the military services have already begun looking into this situation, how they can implement it on their own. And I'm interested again in your views. Third, installation commanders need to be far more active in their oversight role and advocate for the homes of their warfighters and no longer simply rubber stamp incentive fees for housing contractors. Military families also deserve unfettered access to the maintenance records conducted in their homes. Privatized housing companies need to fundamentally overhaul the way in which they conduct customer service and execute work orders. Clearly, these companies are conducting the bare minimum when it comes to maintenance, and Band-Aid fixes are commonplace in order to cut costs and maximize profits. Yet we still may hear from housing companies in the coming months that the answer to the problem is still more BAH. And I agree with the chairman. That's not the answer. All of us, the services, the housing companies, and yes, Congress, have let down the men and women who selflessly serve this country. We need to do better. I look forward to hearing more specific solutions from our distinguished panel today and to working with you as we consider this year's NDAA. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Reed. We'll now hear from our secretaries, and we're going to do this in order of starting with you, Secretary Esper, and then coming across the table.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Your entire statement, of course, will be made a part of the record, and we ask you to confine your remarks to 5 minutes.
Well, good morning, Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. But thank you also for the fact that you gave our families a voice a few weeks ago and brought this issue to everybody's attention. It's had a cathartic effect on us, and we look forward to discussing this matter with you today. But thank you for bringing this issue forward. One of our fundamental obligations as Army leaders is to take care of our soldiers and their families. The recent reports of substandard conditions in some of our military housing units are deeply troubling. It is unacceptable for our families who sacrifice so much for our country to endure these hardships in their homes. We are fully committed to solving this problem and have initiated a number of actions to ensure our soldiers and their families have access to safe, quality military housing across all of our installations. I would like to submit for the record a one-page document that outlines the Army's Housing Action Plan. I believe each of you have a copy at the dais.
Of course.
And will briefly highlight the key actions for the committee.
Yes, it'll be made a part of the record.
Thank you, sir. The Army currently has 111,000 housing units, of which 87,000 were privatized under the RCI program. These homes are managed by 7 private companies across 49 installations. The transition to privatized housing in 1998 marked a dramatic improvement in living conditions for our soldiers and their families. However, this model assumed that the RCI contractors, with sufficient Army oversight, would continue to maintain the quality of these homes. In too many cases, it is clear the private housing companies failed to uphold their end of the bargain, a failure that was enabled by the Army's insufficient oversight. We are determined to investigate these problems and to hold our housing contractors and chains of command accountable. The Army is taking immediate action to fully understand the scope and scale of our military housing problems and to remedy the current housing deficiencies. Within 18 hours of the first hearing on this topic, I traveled with General Milley and Sergeant Major of the Army Daily to Fort Meade, where we personally walked through multiple homes and spoke to our affected families. We also met with the leadership of the privatized housing company and pressed them to take immediate actions. Since then, Army senior leaders have traveled to Fort Bragg, to Fort Belvoir, Fort Campbell, and West Point to conduct our own housing visits and to meet with families and garrison leadership. Over the past 3 weeks, Army installations have conducted town hall meetings in collaboration with the RCI contractors, in addition to establishing housing hotlines. This has provided families a forum to voice their concerns and to report problems directly to garrison commanders. We also ordered all senior commanders to complete a 100% screening of their installation housing by March 18th. Where life, health, and safety issues exist, senior commanders have been instructed to immediately relocate housing residents to temporary quarters until the housing conditions are remediated. This screening process is ongoing, and to date we have completed over 19,000 housing visits. We have also met with the CEOs or senior executives from each of the 7 privatized housing companies to discuss the current problems. The poor customer service, the lack of work order transparency, the inability of residents to hold the housing companies accountable for deficient conditions were common themes presented during our town halls. All of our housing contractors are committed to working together to find ways to improve customer service and to increase transparency. Additionally, they all agreed to ensure sufficient numbers of trained technicians and staff are available at each installation to address problems in a timely manner. To inform our long-term solutions to this problem, we have initiated IG inspections across the 49 installations with RCI Housing. These inspections are focused on customer satisfaction, work order responsiveness, and the ability of our garrison commands to provide proper oversight of our private contractors. Many residents have told us that communication between residents and the private housing companies is broken. To enable greater transparency in the future, we are developing tracking systems to provide a common picture to residents, garrison leadership, and housing contractors. We are also restructuring incentive management plans to more closely align with those areas that are most important to our residents, such as work order resolution and customer satisfaction. It is not acceptable for us to provide high rates of incentive payment when the quality of service provided to our residents is substandard. Furthermore, to ensure our soldiers and their families have proper legal protections, we are working in conjunction with the other services to develop a tenant bill of rights. I believe the committee received this yesterday, and if I may, on behalf of my colleagues and myself, submit this as a record as well, our draft tenant bill of rights. Many Army families are concerned they lack the ability to hold the private housing companies accountable for poorly performed services and are inadequately protected from retaliation. This tenant bill of rights will outline the residents' basic rights while living in military privatized housing, including options that address the problems they are facing most frequently. To better empower our chains of command, we will implement training for garrison command teams on contracting and housing management. Additionally, we will increase garrison staffs to perform quality assurance and quality control checks on work order completion and housing transitions. Furthermore, we will develop our own reporting system for residents to rate timeliness, quality of work, and level of customer service to provide additional data to garrison oversight teams. Providing a safe, quality living environment for our soldiers and their families is critical to the readiness of the force. This is essential to building trust so when soldiers deploy, they can rest assured their families are taken care of back home. To do this, the Army needs to get back involved in the housing business.
Good statement. Secretary Spencer.
Chairman Inhofe.
Use your mic.
Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished guests. I wish I could say I'm pleased to be here today, but I am not. I want to start by first apologizing personally on behalf of the Department of the Navy to any sailor, Marine, soldier, airman, Coast Guardman that was affected by the housing malady that we've seen before us right now. The people of the Navy Marine Corps team will always be our greatest resource and our greatest asset, and the safety and well-being of sailors and Marines and their families is a top priority for all of us. After the initial assessment, I can state with certainty that we can and we will correct the issue at hand, which is not acceptable. We will make the process and the product better in the long run. The solution is based on the simple precepts of communication, education, and attention. And when I say simple, that's just the basic concepts. The details will be forthcoming. I also want you to know that the three service secretaries are working in lockstep. Much that you will hear today, we are doing in coordination. You'll hear of a common lease, the development of that. We are working hand in hand in that regard. On top of the considerable demands of service, no military family should ever have to contend with chronic maintenance issues or concerns such as mold, pests, and intrusions into their house. In order to fulfill our obligation to our families and ensure the strength and readiness of our force, we must demand excellence and responsiveness for all concerned, including our housing partners. It is clear in many cases we have fallen woefully short of this obligation. And upon reviewing the issues surrounding housing, it's apparent there is culpability around the table. We're taking steps to address the immediate problems as well as address our business and education processes to permanently correct systemic issues. Upon the assessment, the CNO and the Commandant of the Marine Corps issued a NAV admin and white letters stating that by April 15th of this year, every Marine and Navy family in private public venture housing will be offered a personal visit from base officials we're getting the uniformed command back into the equation. These command teams will not be satisfied until the housing issues they discussed or observed are resolved. Following that, a regular drumbeat of follow-on chain command attention will follow. We've been in discussion with our private-public venture partners about the availability of apps that are available now, and they are attacking this issue, that allows for reporting, tracking, rating, resolution, and enhancing the communication that is needed between our service people and the private-public venture partner. The three service secretaries will be holding quarterly meetings with the CEOs of our venture partners to address and monitor on a continual basis the satisfactory delivery of housing for our military families. Our housing partners will remain an important component of the housing solution offered to military families. However, our military leaders must never outsource their role as advocates for our service members and their family. The Navy Marine Corps team will continue to pursue improvements in military housing with a sense of urgency to deliver the services our military families deserve, the value the American taxpayers expect, and the readiness our global force requires. Going forward, we look forward to working with this committee to do everything in our power to protect the health, well-being, and safety of our sailors, Marines, and military families wherever they call home. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our military families deserve good housing. And when there's a problem with a house, it should be fixed promptly and competently. Moreover, our airmen should be comfortable that they can identify problems without any fear of retaliation. Over the past 3 weeks, the Chief and I directed the chain of command to do a 100% health and safety review of all Air Force family housing. We have the initial results of that review, and I would ask that this be put into the record.
Without objection.
The real question is, where do we go from here? In the immediate term, we have to take action on all of the health and safety issues that were identified and make sure they are addressed competently and promptly and fixed. The Chief and I also will be clarifying and communicating to our commanders our expectation of them and of our Civil Engineering Center so that we know and they know what we expect from them going forward in taking care of our airmen. In the medium term, we have to fix the system. There are several elements of that based on our initial view. The first is an enforceable Tenants' Bill of Rights, and my colleague has already put that into the record. It's something that the three service secretaries are united on, but it is a draft, and we're looking also for input from all of you. Second, we believe we need to strengthen the base commander input, oversight, and eyes-on when it comes to family housing. That means giving base commanders more input on performance fees, more support when it comes to quality control in their own housing offices, as well as support from the Civil Engineering Center, and more support from contracting representatives who have the ultimate control over those contracts. Third, we need to improve communications and feedback loops to restore trust with airmen. They need to be engaged, not just on that first day when it's so chaotic moving in, but thereafter, so they know what to expect and how to get help when they need it. There are multiple avenues for them to get action and report problems, and we are going to make sure all of those avenues are open. And fourth, the Chief and I have also directed an Inspector General review, which is ongoing to look at the system to identify additional actions that need to be changed to fix the problem. Thank you, Chairman. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Secretary Wilson. All right, for those of you who are not here during the opening of the meeting, we are going to have 7-minute sessions, questions, but we are going to hold you to the 7 minutes because we have a full house here and people do want to be heard on this subject. So I'll start off, and I'll have my first two questions to address to the Army and to the Air Force, not the Navy at this point. And those questions are, and you decide which one is the best one to respond. Number one, when were these issues first brought to your attention, and who should be held accountable? Because you were not aware of what was going on in your own service. And secondly, since these issues were brought to your attention, which installations have you personally visited, and specifically about the issue? Secretary Esper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the first matter, I think with regard to the full realization of the size and scope of this issue came up the week that the committee held its hearing. I think the media reports, coupled with the report of the Military Family Association, and then culminating in the hearing, was what I think brought home to us the size and scale of that. That said, of course, last summer, we were aware of the lead-based paint issues at some of our homes, such as Fort Benning. We quickly took a number of actions. We can talk about that to address that problem, and had been working on it pretty diligently throughout the fall. And then at a family forum in October, the chief and I, as we meet with families and discuss issues, there were some housing issues in singular homes at, I think, Schofield Barracks and Fort Gordon and another like West Point, where we quickly attacked those problems and remediated them, but nothing with regard to the size and scope that you heard from the witnesses that appeared before this committee.
The second part of that question was, since these issues were brought to your attention, how many installations have you and the chief and either supervised or personally visited?
Yes, sir. I personally visited Fort Meade and Fort Bragg, and I'm supposed to go down to Fort Belvoir next week. And, of course, every time I visit an installation, I meet with families and do town halls. So I talk about this quite often.
Chief, have you?
In terms of the timeline, Chairman, similar. The July-August timeframe for the lead paint. Then in October, November, started becoming aware of some reports on mold, and then it really came into fruition at the time of the hearings and the media.
Okay, well, let me tell both of you, I appreciate the briefing that you've given me, and I know that you've been very busy since the last meeting that we had. I appreciate that very much. Secretary Wilson.
Mr. Chairman, since your hearing, I have visited MacDill, Tinker, and Shaw Air Force bases. With respect to, I'm sorry, Chief. With respect to awareness of the problems, the Air Force was aware of construction defects at 4 bases, and on page 7 and 8 of the handout in front of you, it highlights those dates on where we were aware of construction defects and the actions that we're taking there. I think, though, that while the Air Force was managing those projects and getting construction defects taken care of, what we really didn't understand was the decline in trust and confidence in the airmen that problems would get fixed. And that is, to me, the most important part of the hearing that you had that brought that forward to us.
Yes, ma'am, and I'll just add that Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, Chief Wright, and I went to Keesler and Maxwell Air Force Base, and our findings were very consistent with the testimony that you heard from the families that came forward. And I'll second what the Secretary said, that the most concerning to me that I found was the breakdown in trust that we've got to rebuild, as you've said, Chairman.
Yeah, was anything exercising back your memory of the previous testimony that came from the homeowners, was anything found to be inaccurate from their testimony?
No, sir. Very accurate.
Okay. Secretary Spencer, would you respond to the same questions? And I have a separate question for you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Since the hearings, I personally have visited 3 communities in the Hampton Roads area, Camp Lejeune and Cherry Point, to visit housing and meet with people there. We stepped right out right after the hearings, went out to the West Coast, our office did, to inspect what was going out there and hearing from the families of their concerns. Nothing we found that they reported was inconsistent.
Admiral, do you want to add to that?
So I personally visited Patuxent River and then facilities around the Naval District of Washington area, and have flag officers who have also gone to the Pacific Northwest, the Southwest. And so we've got good eyes on this problem, and nothing that we've seen is inconsistent with the testimony and the, I guess, the witness of the residents. And I would just echo that We became aware of this, I think, about the time that everybody else did in terms of the magnitude of the problem and the fact that the actual truth on the ground was differing to a great degree from the information that we were responding to, which is why we're getting after 100% awareness.
All right, I appreciate that. Secretary Spencer, a recent news article states that the Navy is moving forward with creating a new Assistant Secretary for Information Management, which by default would eliminate your Assistant Secretary for Energy, Installations, and Environment. Now, that second one I mentioned is the part of the bureaucracy that is responsible for what led to this meeting now. Now, you came to our committee, and both the majority and the minority, and said you wanted to make an announcement. We told you not to, and you did it anyway. I'd like to know, first of all, why you did it, and then secondly, would you be in a position right now to commit to this committee to not dispose of the position that is responsible for the problems that led to this committee today at the conclusion of this meeting?
Senator, I'll take full responsibility for what my office does. I did speak to your staff and the ranking staff about the idea that we wanted to put together in light of the cyber report, which you will soon be exposed to, that we did in the Navy after we had our exfiltrations. It's a risk that we have to manage. I apologize for my office getting ahead of the lights. That was not my intent. We are marching along that we will keep everything in place as is.
Okay, will you commit to keeping that position, your current Assistant Secretary for Energy, Installations, and Environment?
I will.
Very good. Thank you. Senator Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. I'll begin with the Army, and who's ever appropriate can respond. I would hope that the housing companies are cooperating with you in addressing these problems. Some might require contractual changes. Is that cooperation evident and positive and genuine?
So far, yes, sir. The chief and I and our senior Army leaders met within several days of the hearing with all 7 companies. I think they were saying the right things. They agreed up front to, for example, eliminating non-refundable fees. They agreed to suspending the energy program and a number of things. But I think over time there will be more challenging tasks at hand, such as renegotiating lease agreements at the installations. We need to restructure the incentive fees. So time will tell. And I think the oversight by this committee helps give us the leverage to push those changes through.
Well, I know that the chairman and I are both committed to oversight continuously on this issue until all the problems are resolved. Some of the suggestions that have been made, and just get your reaction, and I'll ask the other services, a uniform lease for all military personnel, the ability to withhold BAH if there's unsatisfactory response to complaints. Perhaps that has to be validated by your housing officer, but
that's right. At
some point, the BAH should be not the right of the company, but in payment for adequate housing. Is that something you're producing?
Yes, sir. That's one of the items we put into the Tenant Bill of Rights is the ability to withhold BAH, and then, at least for the Army, we could arbitrate that issue between the provider and the soldier and make sure we come out to a proper solution. And I think on your first point with regard to a common leasing agreement, I think it's fair. It's the right thing to do for our service members because I have Navy personnel and Air Force personnel on Army bases or Army personnel on Navy bases. I think the ability for a service member to go from base to base to base and have a common set of expectations with regard to the type of housing will be provided would be very helpful to the force.
Then all I would ask is, as you go forward and there are issues you think should be properly covered in the NDAA, if you could make the chairman and myself aware of them, we'd appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
Much.
Will do.
And Secretary Spencer, with respect to the Navy, you're cooperating so far productively with the housing companies, and you're trying to implement many of the similar proposals that Secretary Esper is?
Yes, Senator. We're having, I would actually call them fairly robust conversations with the partners, again, to get back on education, communication, and attention.
Very good. And Issues like a uniform lease, issues with respect to withholding BAH, that is, you're considering those too?
Most definitely. It goes along with the Bill of Rights. When the three of us were talking about the creation of this, we realized that we wanted to get something out there in draft form for you all to view, for the communities to view. There is a lot of work to be done on this because we will revisit the operating agreement more than likely. It's going to take time, but we got to get it right because it's a good tool.
Secretary Wilson, your comments.
Senator, I also think that the idea of a common lease makes sense because we do have members on each other's facilities. And as my colleagues mentioned, the draft of the Bill of Rights that we released yesterday does allow for withholding of basic allowance for housing.
One of the issues that I think has come up with respect to new construction, you mentioned, Secretary Wilson, that you found some problems in construction. Housing code standards are, it's funny, you go out the front gate and the jurisdiction of the municipality has rigorous housing code standards which people meet. I got the impression from talking to the families that there's no real housing codes, that it's what the company does or what essentially you allow them to do. So would it be useful to develop sort of standard housing codes in terms of initial construction and maintenance? Whoever wants to jump ball, Secretary Spencer or Secretary?
In the case of the Navy, sir, NAVFAC oversees with the ultimate arbiter and creator of the standards in that regards.
And those standards are the commanders at the bases are aware of those standards, the personnel are aware of those standards so that they can, if they have a legitimate complaint, they can make it?
That I am not aware of. Senator, I can get back to you on that.
My again, an impression from talking and listening to the families was that there was no clear idea by either the post-housing authorities or anyone else of what really the standard was. So that you could have a situation where they could come 52 times to make minor repairs and not effectively deal with the problem.
Just to clear the record straight, I was commenting on original construction. When it comes to maintenance calls, your observation is correct, and that is one of the things we're getting at is the ability to put the tools in the hands of the military family without taking up too much time. Quickly to photograph the problem, track the problem, send the photograph back to the maintenance people if they don't think the problem has been corrected. The chain of command is in that communication loop. That is the primary leg of communication.
Secretary Esper, you had a point.
Yes, sir. Senator Reid, you're pulling on a very important thread here. As we've assessed the situation to date within the Army, one of the things we realize we need to work on, we need to improve, is the education of our garrison commanders and our sergeant majors to effectively do their job, whether it's oversight of the contractors, understanding building codes, quality assurance, quality control, all those things. We need to and working to build that into their training, into their program of instruction. We're looking to do the same thing with regard to our commanders and the pre-command courses, re-educating them, if you will, on housing management and what their role is as commanders and leaders.
Well, let me reiterate what I think the Chairman expressed very clearly. This is an issue that we will stay engaged with, and it will take a while. We understand that. But this is not going to be a passing sort of review and trust to the goodwill and good wishes of everybody involved. We're going to keep our involved and engaged. And any aspects of the NDA that has to be modified to help you make sure that the men and women of the services have the best housing, just let us know. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Senator Wickle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. What I think I hear is a determination to really get to the problem and fix it. I know that's a determination up here. I appreciate what Senator Reid just said about staying after this. Let me, as an Air Force veteran, let me direct my questions to Secretary Wilson and General Goldfein. And General Goldfein, I appreciate you visiting Keesler recently. Let me start by asking you what you found there. And to summarize, this has been an ongoing problem for quite some time, dating back as far as 2011 at Keesler. There is a program called the Moisture Remediation Project, MRP. Some of the information we've gotten from the military members there is that this has been sort of a surface attempt to go in clean the affected area with soap and water or some sort of disinfectants and not get behind and actually go to the root cause. This went so far as 11 families at Keesler having to file a lawsuit against the contractor in the summer of last year, seeking punitive damages and accusing the company of fraud and concealment. So it's a serious problem that's been there for a long time. So let me ask you this: in addition to telling us, General Goldfein, what you found, to what extent are military members required now to live in base housing? When I was a young officer, I had the option. I could go off base, get my basic allowance and rent or buy off base. So to what extent is it more or less a requirement to live in this housing now? Is this a problem inherent in the way we do privatized housing construction now, or is this can this happen either way we do it? And so if you would talk about those things, and then I might let Secretary Wilson follow up.
Thanks. Thanks, Senator. You know, when I went down there, I looked at the remediation program, the mold remediation program that they're doing, and dug into the issues that they're looking at. What I found there, so I'm going to be 60 years old this year, and I've lived in military family housing now for 50 years. I grew up in it. I raised my children in it. When I deployed for 2 years, I put my family in it. And what I found at Keesler, which was very consistent with the testimony we heard, is there are three things that families today are worried about that I never worried about, either as a parent or as a kid growing up. I never once worried about the health of my children relative to living in a home. And we now have families that have testified, and I saw that at Keesler, they're worried about the health of their children. The second thing I never worried about, living on base is the ultimate gated community experience. It's the one place where your kids can play until dark. I never worried for my kids about the safety and security of the infrastructure in the neighborhood. And parents today of airmen today are concerned about that. The third thing I never worried about, I never worried that if I actually complained about the housing, that there would be a fear of reprisal or that my command chain and leadership wouldn't get after it. And so as we look through the long-term fixes that Secretary Wilson laid out for the Air Force, we have to get at those three issues. And Senator Reid, what you said about this being a long-term issue, excitement in the near term based on hearings is interesting, not compelling. We're going to have to keep our boot on the throat of the underperforming contractors and our command chain and leadership to make sure we get after this for the long term, and we're committed to do so.
Do they have to live on base housing now?
No, sir. As a matter of fact, there's a waterfall approach that we take. It's somewhat unique to the individual installation, but they have the choice to live on or off base.
Do you think there's something wrong with the program itself?
Sir, I think the program has got to work. We've got to make it work. And where we have failed is to ensure that we have command chain involvement, oversight, leadership, quality control, and follow-up.
And what did you find with regard to this moisture remediation project, MRP, with regard to the accusations that they're just treating the surface and not getting back in there and finding the problem?
From what I saw, far more thorough a construction effort than what's been described. I did not see any painting over. I saw complete reconstruction, pulling out walls, going into the pipes. So I thought I saw much more significant engineering work to get after it. But this is a trust but verify solution for the future.
Is the contractor doing that?
They are.
Okay. This is a little off the subject, but let me just mention this and ask you to answer on the record. I've been concerned for a number of years about unaccompanied housing in Korea, particularly at Osan. And so if you could get back to me on the record about how many of our enlisted airmen at Osan are now having to live in barracks that are not yet remodernized and remediated. If you could get back to me on the record about that, I would appreciate it. It's been something I've been asking about for years and years. So thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. The hearing 3 weeks ago was very gripping, very graphic. Poor communication, poor physical condition, possibilities of retaliation, and overwhelmingly a lack of military oversight of this program. I'm going to be touring Norfolk Naval Base tomorrow and meeting with families there. The housing companies, the 7, they must improve, but it's the military that must solve this problem. People didn't enlist to be a tenant of a private housing company. They enlisted to be a Marine, a soldier, a sailor, an airman or woman, or a coastie, and so their deal is with you, really not with the housing company. You are obligated to solve this problem for them. A few questions. My understanding is the contracts with the private housing providers, since it was a new initiative, offered the opportunity for the military to reopen the contracts at the 5-year point to see how the program was doing, and yet that opportunity was not taken up by the military. Is that your understanding?
Senator, as far as I'm concerned, that is my understanding. The program at that point seemed to be going swimmingly well, and I gather no one availed themselves of the opportunity.
Any different testimony on that, or is that generally understood? Thank you. I was a mayor, and I had a code office that used to do code compliance inspections at housing all over my city. In the first hearing, we asked the housing providers, I asked the question about whether they would agree with me that somebody living on a base shouldn't be living in housing that is substandard to the housing that surrounds the base, and they all agreed with that proposition. In your dialogue about solving this problem, are you contemplating using the expertise of existing local housing code compliance officials to try to make sure that housing on a base is at a minimum equal to the standards in the surrounding communities? Secretary Wilson and then Secretary Spencer.
Senator, we actually think that we need to improve the quality assurance, many of these within our military housing offices, because those are the ones that are responsible to the base commander, and that this is a command chain issue. And where we've had private housing contractors who are underperforming, we haven't really had the support there for the wing commander to go in and do the quality assurance that needs to be done. And so we think that that's where it needs to improve.
Secretary Spencer.
Most definitely across the board. Senator, you've heard me say it before. I'm a firm believer that we find the best practices wherever they may be. Here is an industry that is a robust, mature industry in North America. Yes, we can find best practices and incorporate it in our system.
I can see challenges of using local officials. They might be pretty busy, but the idea of bringing in local code officials a couple of times a year, base commander might work with them to come in and do spot audits on a number of communities. Code offices would be thrilled to help you with something like this. And that's not to say that the military shouldn't have its own expertise, but when you have code compliance officers who do this day in, day out in the very communities where these folks live, who would be willing to help you, I think you should take advantage of that resource. We will be voting next week on the President's emergency declaration. The President's proposed to pull $3.5 billion out of the MILCON budget, $2.5 billion out of the drug interdiction budget within the DOD. That funding source only has about $85 million available in it right now, and so the reports we've read suggest that there would be an effort in the Pentagon to pull money from other accounts into that account to plus it up to $2.5 billion. I am very worried in contemplating this particular challenge that should this go forward, some of that $6 billion could come out of monies that would be needed to solve this problem. I don't know whether you can answer this question or not, but I want to ask it. Can you assure me that none of the $6 billion that is being pulled from the Pentagon budget to deal with what General O'Shaughnessy testified last week as a non-military emergency, can you assure me that none of that money will come from funds that were slated to be used to deal with base housing either here in the United States or overseas?
Senator, I can assure you that that is certainly my position as well, and I've articulated that to Secretary Shanahan, and I think there's a general agreement within the department that we should not tap into either military housing or barracks, I should add. But I don't have final say over that, so I cannot give the 100% assurance, but that's my view.
That's your recommendation?
Yeah, absolutely.
How about to the other secretary? Secretary Spencer?
Same here. Prioritization, it's right up there, and that'd be my recommendation.
Right. Secretary Wilson?
That is my position as well.
Thank you very much. Let me ask one more question. The testimony last week and during this hearing is very focused on military family housing, as it should be. What are you doing to look at housing for single members of the military? Are you also engaged in that effort to try to make sure that they are living in conditions that aren't substandard?
Senator, with regard to the inspections we have underway right now, those also include barracks where our soldiers live. So we want to make sure that, and we're picking up some issues there in the barracks also. So we want to make sure we address that. And overall, and Senator Reid mentioned it, we want to make sure that we're also checking in on our soldiers who are off base. I think we have a responsibility to take care of our soldiers wherever they live and their dependents.
Secretary Spencer?
Again, Senator, as we said earlier, the three of us are working together on this issue, and we're in lockstep doing the same thing that the Army's doing.
Great, thank you. Secretary Wilson, or General Goldfein.
Thanks, sir. And during my trip to Keesler, I went and visited the dorms. I walked through the dorms as well. Dorms built in 1951. And so as we take a look at this in the future, we're going to make sure that we do not only military family housing, but all housing where airmen live and work.
Mr. Chair, thank you.
Thank you. Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin. Ellsworth Air Force Base is in Rapid City, South Dakota, and immediately when this started to come up, my thoughts went back to what we have for housing at Ellsworth and so forth. And so my first question, I guess, would be to Secretary Wilson. I'm just curious, we all agree the maintenance issues that we're discussing here today are simply unacceptable. Is privatized housing still a viable option for our military families? And if privatized housing is still the appropriate and viable approach, what immediate and long-term actions would you propose to fix these types of problems?
Thank you, Senator. I think many of us in this room remember what housing was like in the mid-'90s and early 2000s. And while we are having problems with some of our private contractors, I think overall housing is in better shape than it was at the time that this initiative was started. And so I believe that, and I saw it myself at bases in New Mexico at the time. And as a young officer, I never lived in on-base housing. I lived off-base as a single officer. But I do think that the housing is better than what we had in the 1990s overall. That doesn't mean that we change our approach to demanding that when there is a problem, it is promptly fixed and fixed in a competent way. There are a few things that I think will help. The Tenants' Bill of Rights, I think, will help, and it will allow us to have some leverage to work through these contracts and change the way things are managed. I think we do need to strengthen the role of the base commander so that they have input and control and leverage with the local contractor. I think we need to improve the communications and feedback loops for our airmen so they have multiple ways to address problems, and if they're not getting a response, to get somebody to help them in the chain of command. And finally, we have an IG review underway that'll identify other systemic fixes that the chief and I will deal with. Those are long-term. In the immediate term, we've got our command chain that is identified and gone through houses, and we are focused on fixing the problems that are identified.
Secretary Spencer, same question. Would you agree that this is still a viable option and should be continued?
Senator, when the hearings finished, one of the things that I did was sit down with three of the authors of this actual solution back in 1996, and spent some time with them as to how they addressed the problem they were solving and what the solution was. If you look at the history of where we've been and where we are now, as an example, the service secretaries met with the private partner venture partners once a month. Base commanders met with the local private partner ventures once a month, and the program was going along quite well. The fact of the matter is, we did take our eye off the ball. We know that. That's why I'm telling you, this is, to solve this problem, we have what we need right now, 80% of it. And we'll let you know, obviously, if we need more as a backstop or whatever, we can call on you for the NDAA. This is a viable solution. I was a single person also when I was in the Marine Corps, but I have vivid memories visiting my married friends, and the product is a much better product that we have now. That does not mean that we need to fix this, and I think the tools that we have in the immediacy and the long term will affect that.
Thank you. Secretary Esper, same question.
Yes, Senator, from everything I've learned to date, I believe it's a workable model. We need to continue to study the issue and get back to you with any recommendations. I think any program over time needs adjustments, and that's the piece of this we owe you, in addition, obviously, to the initiatives we are implementing and the need for the chain of command to get back involved.
Thank you. I think the idea of a Bill of Rights is very important, and I think it's one that I think perhaps this committee may very well want to play a part in terms of determining what it actually looks like. I also think the fact that you have an ombudsman as a part of the discussion is going to be critical, because I think there's something else that has to be discussed, and we haven't really talked about it yet, but there's clear evidence of negligence, perhaps fraud, breach of contract, with regard to the contractors and the way that they have, in some cases, managed their responsibilities. I think this list may very well continue to grow as you inspect these facilities. Why have we not taken these contractors to court, suing them on behalf of our families and our government? And is the government too cozy with these contractors to show them what they have done wrong, perhaps immoral, and in some cases outright illegal? Secretary Esper.
Senator, I think you're asking many of the same questions we are asking internally. I think we need to look at the accountability aspects of this. I've walked through some homes where I've seen work done where I don't know whether it is just simple, pure incompetence or some type of fraudulence or negligence. But, our immediate challenge right now is fixing the problems before us with regard to work orders and getting the families right. But I do think we need a deeper look at the accountability aspects of this.
Will you commit to following through and reporting back what you find with regard to any anomalies that have to be pursued through legal channels?
Yes, sir, absolutely, and particularly with regard to retaliation. So that's what one of the issues most acutely that troubles me. In fact, I had a discussion just yesterday with one of the CEOs about an employee, and I was very clear in stating that I want this matter looked into. I want to know what you find, and I want to know how this person will be held accountable if this behavior was ongoing.
Very good. I have 1 minute left. Secretary Spencer, same question.
Same answer with, we took a step forward. We are launching naval audit to actually provide some audit functions in certain areas where we have concern.
Thank you. Secretary Wilson?
Senator, we take all indications of fraud seriously. We investigate them and we'll act accordingly.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Round. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The key thing coming out of this, it seems to me, is that good intentions and emergency discussions and, these kinds of reassurances aren't going to solve this problem. This strikes me as a structural problem, and I want to focus in on the contract with these entities, because one of the problems is the customer on those contracts is the Navy or the Army or the Air Force, not the tenant. So if the enforcement of the contract has to rest upon the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force. Do you see what I'm saying? That there's a disconnect there. So I presume these contracts, I'll ask you, Secretary Spencer, are incentive-based. They're incentives for good performance. Is that correct?
That is correct, Senator.
And second question is, can these contracts be modified in any way now? I know some of them are really long-term, like 50 years. Is there any reopener or opportunity to renegotiate at all?
I would, it being a document of operation, I would hope we can, I'm not a lawyer, but we plan to actually open it up and address it with the venture partners.
I think that would be important, and the incentives, it seems to me, have to be important. There should be approval rating surveys of the tenants, and if it's not above 90%, I understand in some of these contracts it's 75%. That's a pretty low bar. and they don't get paid if they don't meet that. That's the structural part of it, it seems to me, that needs to be addressed.
I would agree.
And the question is, let's say you had a perfect contract, but if it's not enforced, if it's not managed properly by the service, then it's still not going to work. And there has to be somebody either at the base, and I don't know the answer to this, either at the base or at the Pentagon, I would think the base, who's responsible and who's accountable for the enforcement of this contract. My old management theory is you need one throat to choke. Somebody who is one person who's accountable, and I hope that's part of your discussion. Secretary Esper?
Yes, sir. I think there are multiple facets to this issue that have to be attacked simultaneously. So there, first of all,
you can have a perfect contract, but if it's not managed properly, it's not going to work.
Absolutely. So the first contract is the contract that the leasing arrangement that a resident comes in and signs. That needs to be cleaned up, and that needs to reflect what's in the Bill of Rights. So we need to update that one. Then there's the contract at the garrison level, the one that includes incentive fees and stuff like that. Those incentive fees should also reflect what we want to pursue in the Bill of Rights. It needs to reflect that as well. And then I need quality assurance people at each level handling it. We need, as we discussed with the CEOs, we need qualified professional people performing the work. The Chief of Staff and I heard of instances where an employee would come in to fix something in the home, and he'd have to pull out his iPhone and watch a YouTube video to learn how to repair the work. So this problem...
I do that too, but I'm not a professional in repairing pipes.
Exactly. So this problem has to be tackled on multiple levels, certainly from the contractors, and then we have an important role, at least with the Army, in terms of doing quality assurance, quality control, training our garrison commanders to make sure that we implement and enforce the garrison level arrangements vigorously.
Well, Secretary Spencer, it seems to me that technology can help us out here. You could develop I would call it a RAT app, where the tenant can take a picture, send it, it would automatically go to the person who's responsible for managing the contract and the contractor, and the clock would start running, and there would be a way of keeping track of whether that repair was made and how it was made and how soon it was made. This is something that's within the realm of our capability these days.
Most definitely, Senator. That's one of the three legs I was talking about: educate, communicate, and pay attention. But we are actually having discussions with the venture partners right now about inculcating one of those.
Now, one of the word retaliation has come up several times in this hearing, and I don't quite understand that. Who's retaliating? Secretary Wilson, are we talking about the military folks on the base retaliating for a tenant complaining, or are we talking about the company? Who's retaliating?
Sir, I've asked, because I heard the testimony, and that was actually from your hearing the thing that bothered me most, was because if people feel as though if they act, there will be retaliation, then they're not going to report problems, and we're not going to know what's going on. The fear, the only one that I identified and talked to a member about directly, where there was a fear, had to do with the housing office calling the first sergeant of somebody and saying, "Hey, your guy's making problems over here." In that case, the first sergeant talked to his member, and the airman said exactly what was going on, and he said, "Wow, if you need my help, man, how can I do to help? What can I do to help you?" But there is a fear of potential consequences if you complain in some cases. Not that I have not found a case where it happened. I would also say, though, you identified something that I think is important. That
Could
this
you repeat that? I like
payment,
hearing that in these hearings. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
You mentioned third-party payment. I think this is one of the sources of frustration for our airmen. They sign a lease, but their basic allowance for housing goes directly, basically, from the Air Force to the contractor. If you were downtown paying your rent payment to your landlord and you had a problem with rats or mold or whatever,
there's a direct relationship.
There's a direct relationship. You can report it, and if you don't get a satisfactory answer, you can walk in and holding your check and saying, I'm not going to give you this until you fix this problem. There's a greater feeling of control, and I think that lack of direct control is the reason why in this Bill of Rights we've included the right to withhold your basic allowance for housing.
It's all for naught unless the customer, which is you, enforce the contract on behalf of that tenant. That's a crucial part of this. I'm running out of time, but for the record, not now, but for the record, could you all submit the copies of these contracts, and they can be redacted for, proprietary reasons? I'd very much like to see the terms and how the incentives are structured and those kinds of things. If you could do that for the committee.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Cotton.
Good morning to all of our service secretaries and service chiefs. We rarely see all of you together. I think that reflects the seriousness with which this committee takes this problem. I think we've all had the same reactions to the very troubling reports of unsafe and unclean conditions at contractor-managed housing at military bases around the country. Stories are really terrible. Kids struggling to breathe because of black mold, lead paint, rodent infestations, exposed wiring, doctor's office visits where doctors plead with the family to move out for the sake of their child's health. My office has reached out to Colonel Donahue, the 19th Air Wing Commander and Installation Commander at Little Rock Air Force Base, to explore the issue there. It's not perfect by any means, but it doesn't seem to have the same systemic problems we've seen elsewhere. They've got about 1,000 total units under private management. About 2/3 of those are occupied, and about 2/3 of those report no problems or did not request an inspection. That still leaves over 200 visual inspections that identified problems that are currently being remediated, like moisture and lead paint and rodent infestation. Secretary Wilson, General Goldfein, I know that you will work to make sure that those conditions are remediated promptly. I also want to commend the Military Family Advisory Network for the work they've done bringing this situation to everyone's attention. We ought to address it with the utmost speed. We already ask a lot from our troops and our military families to sacrifice in terms of their freedom and their comfort for ours. I think the least we can do is to make sure that they have a safe, clean home whenever they get off duty or when they're downrange and their husbands and wives and kids are back by themselves. I think we've explored a lot of the fundamental issues already, so I want to give our service secretaries and service chiefs an opportunity to speak directly to some of their troops and families around the world. I know that you don't often get a chance to do this, but this is a pretty high-profile hearing. It will probably be highlighted on the Armed Forces Network and on military family social media sites and in your services' respective media outlets. Everyone on this panel has been a lieutenant or an ensign before, so I know you've all worked with junior soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine to address their housing concerns. Obviously, when you sit in the Pentagon at the top of your service, you can't have visibility into every single one of those. But I know we do expect our young platoon leaders and platoon sergeants and section chiefs to be on top of their troops' living accommodations. So starting with General Milley and going down the row, let's just speak directly to each one of those platoon leaders, platoon sergeants, squad leaders, and team leaders. You do want them to be on top of the living situation of every one of their soldiers, whether they live in on-base, off-post housing, or they have a family. Is that correct, General Milley?
That's correct, Senator. And I would say that, as it's been true for 10,000 years of military history, a commander, it's a very special duty position. It's a privilege. It's not a right. And our duty as commanders is to be responsible for everything our units fail to do or succeed at. That's a long, tried and true tradition. That includes housing, readiness, training, fighting, taking the hill, doing whatever. And that includes housing. So I want all of the soldiers out there to know that their chain of command is now fully engaged, and it is our personal responsibility, and we will be held personally accountable for the condition of their living quarters or their houses.
Thank you. Admiral Richardson.
Senator, the same exists. It's a privilege to lead our sailors in the United States Navy, and that I agree with you that the center of gravity is at small unit leadership, and it is not only a privilege to become a small unit leader, a senior enlisted leader or a junior officer, but it's also one of the most rewarding things that you can do to develop those people under your charge. That development starts with ensuring that the fundamentals, the basics are taken care of. And I would include not only housing, but also pay, food, safety, all of those things that are just absolutely fundamental to human existence. I'd just say to all of our sailors and those small unit leaders, we're committed to making that relationship productive. Those leaders will be our sailors' advocates as we navigate through the recovery process here. We will move out with urgency, and we will, to Senator King's point, establish a structure that will be sustainable so that we don't find ourselves here again in 5 or 10 years. Thank you.
General Neller.
I would say this not just to the small unit leader, but the entire chain of command. The nation expects their Marines to be the most lethal ready force on the face of the earth. And we have a lot of things to do to achieve that requirement. But part of that is taking care of our families and our Marines and where they live, whether it be in the barracks, whether it be in base, government-owned PPV, or out in town. And so this is part of our responsibility. I mean, that goes with being a commander, being a leader. You're responsible for all your unit does or all it fails to do. And so I need everybody to understand why we're doing this. It's part of readiness. We need our families ready. We need a Marine can't be ready if he or she's not living in a secure, safe place. And so I personally commit that we'll get after this. I agree with Secretary Spencer. I think, and Chairman Imhoff mentioned this, back in the day, it was a different place, a different time. And I think we took our eye off the ball. And we've been a little busy the last 17 years, as you know, Senator, but that's no excuse. And so we've got to re-educate ourselves about what our responsibilities are as unit leaders, and that includes taking care of the families.
General Goldfein.
Thanks, Senator. When I talk to young command team groups, senior officers and NCOs, I tell them that a lot of things we do as senior leaders, we do the best we can. There's one thing we do that's nothing short of sacred duty and a moral obligation, and I believe it's our mirror check. And that's to ensure that every airman that we send into harm's way to do the nation's business is properly organized, trained, equipped, and well led. And then when they get the job done and return to their families, we've taken care of them while they've been gone. That's a moral obligation. And so my message to all airmen is that we are not going to stop until we ensure that we have the system right to take care of them.
Thank you, General Goldfein. If I could plead for 30 seconds, Mr. Chairman, I think it's very important that our troops hear this. As Senator King said, there have been reports of retaliation and reports of non-responsiveness to complaints. I'd just like our service chiefs to speak directly once again to their troops and assure us, yes or no, that there is zero tolerance for any retaliation if you complain about the conditions of your residence. General Milley.
Absolute zero tolerance.
Admiral Richardson.
Same, zero tolerance.
General Neller.
Zero tolerance.
General Goldfein.
4.
There you have it. Family members and troops on the front lines, when you have these problems, the top boss in every one of your services has said there will be zero tolerance, there will be immediate responses to your problems. You should bring them forward and make sure that you and your families have a safe residence while we work through the bigger structural problems we have.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Esper, I want to start with you, and I certainly agree that we need a tenant Bill of Rights, and we've heard a lot of really good testimony from all of you and a lot of good questions from my colleagues about using that as a tool to address the unresponsiveness between some of these contractors and people in the housing, as well as the issue of who is the customer, because I can tell you from personal experience of people who've reached out to me, both a concern that they would be held that there could be retribution when they raise issues, and then also the issue of not having the contractor be adequately responsive because they're not the customer. But I want to switch gears and maybe come back to that issue and address the other half of this, because I think half of this is contract quality and enforcement of that contract, and half of it is basic standards and enforcement of those standards. So I want to understand the lay of the land across the board. We heard from a former mayor. I'm a former city councilor. Any mayor, councilor, county commissioner will tell you that we have tools to deal with this. They're building codes. And I want to understand across all the services what the current standards are. So Secretary Espert, in the Army, what is the building code standard that base housing must be built to in your service branch? Is it uniform, or is it governed by the local or state building code standard at the site?
Yes, sir. My understanding is that under the umbrella agreement under which this privatized housing operates, that the commitment is that the privatized housing would abide by local standards,
okay,
and it would be overseen by them as well. That said, I would want to take a look at what those standards are to make sure that they meet what our expectations are as leaders. We may need higher standards and a common standard, if you will. We've talked a lot about commonality here with regard to leasing agreements. I think common standards, common high-quality standards are the way to go.
I think you're dead on, and I think you're onto something here, because there is a patchwork of standards across the United States. County and city, we have, you know, Secretary Wilson is very familiar with Kirtland Air Force Base a few blocks from my house. They do not fall under the city of Albuquerque's jurisdiction, because that's where the boundary for the city stops. They're under the state or county standards. So I do think it makes sense for all of us to look at a uniform standard that may be a higher bar for safety, for comfort, for energy efficiency than what may be appropriate at the local level or what local politics might dictate. So for the other service secretaries, what is the current standard, and what is your opinion on the sort of approach that Secretary Espert just
Senator, to underscore the fact we probably need standardization, it's my understanding that we are held to a government standard, a DOD-oriented government standard, and my Naval Facilities Organization oversees the enforcement of those standards on original construction.
Secretary Wilson.
Senator, the Air Force Civil Engineering Center oversees the uniform DOD standard for construction. I think where we've had problems is in quality assurance of repairs and quality control, and that is often a manning issue, and we need to address that issue base by base.
Who, for each of the secretaries, once again, who would be responsible in your service branch for performing basic inspections to make sure that either new or existing construction meets code and or meets the standard for repairs?
Senator, I think if it's new construction, it's likely our Corps of Engineers would be responsible. And I think in all cases, whether it's that and repairs, it would be the garrison chain of command. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say, at the end of the day, the chain of command of that soldier also being involved is certainly on work orders will be extremely important. And to Secretary Wilson's point, we're looking at the same thing as we staff up at all of our installations, making sure we have sufficient quality assurance, quality control personnel at every step of the process are involved, and either doing 100% depending on the nature of if it's a life, health, and safety work order, or spot checking if it's a routine work order.
Okay. Secretary Spencer.
In the case of the Navy, sir, CNIC and then the local housing office would be the responsible parties. Again, just reverberating what Secretary Esper and Secretary Wilson said, the quality, it's the quality control and quality assurance aspect that is going to be the real nuts and bolts to make sure that we enforce what we have.
Okay.
Senator, on your bases, you will have a housing management office that is as we mentioned, undermanned for quality assurance. The Civil Engineering Squadron, with support from the Civil Engineering Center, assesses and the compliance with code-like items.
I want to thank all of you for the commitment that you made to Senator Cotton with regard to retribution. I also want to ask, what are we doing to make sure that that commanding officers understand that, as well as sending that message to rank and file? I have had at least one constituent raise the issue that they were afraid to bring some of these issues forward. So what is the mechanism, Generals and Admiral, for just sending that message loud and clear that we have an issue, and if you raise issues, you're going to be listened to, and you're not going to be held to some form of retribution?
The chain of command is command information mechanisms throughout the force to get that word out, but it is well understood that any sort of action, a reprisal action or retribution action against anybody who raises a complaint about anything, whether it's the IG, the EO, the EEO, housing, or you name it, It is illegal. It is not just against policy and regulation. It is illegal. And you will be held accountable if you engage in any sort of reprisal action against anybody who raises a complaint about anything. It's zero tolerance, period.
Admiral.
Senator, if I could just agree with General Milley, but just to make sure that we were clear here, it was a specific part of the NAV admin message that I sent to the Navy to make sure that we are particularly sensitive to this because perception can be as powerful as reality here.
Exactly.
And then I did a social media post, made it clear there, the the visit guidelines for visits to homes include a part of this, so we're being extremely sensitive to making sure that certainly we meet the legal requirements, but we also, from a perception management thing, are open to this.
Excellent.
I agree with both the chief and the CNO. In the white letter I sent out to all commanders directing the housing outreach with the intent to visit at the permission of the service member, their home either in a PPV or out in town. There's very clear guidance on what they can and cannot do, and what whether they refuse to visit or not. But as General Milley said, any reprisal and anyone who makes an allegation is illegal.
I know that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to go back to the subject of contracts. I understand that Senator King asked about some of these contracts with the private entities and requested copies of relevant contracts. I'd like to see those as well. Let me begin by directing this towards the service secretaries. Secretary Esper, I noticed in your written testimony you talk about the model, this model of private housing, private partnership, and you say the model assumes that the contractors with sufficient oversight will continue to maintain the quality of these homes. I note the verb assumes. Do these contracts lay out particular standards? Are these private housing operators, are they contractually obligated to maintain particular standards in these housing developments? We'll start with you, Secretary Esper.
Yes, sir. I've reviewed a few of them, and having read through them, there are standards in there, but I do think we need to look into them, renegotiate them, and make sure that the standards are high and sufficient and meet the Bill of Rights that we've outlined here today.
Mm-hmm. Senator, the standards are there. We need to enforce the standards. It's, again, not a brilliant flash of the obvious. We were not keeping our eye on the ball. The housing office needed to be the quality control check and balance here if there was a complaint. We have the processes. Now we have to live up to performing the processes.
Mm-hmm. Same for you, Secretary Wilson.
Senator, the contracts do have standards in them. The issue is ensuring that we enforce those standards when we have a contractor who is a subpar performer.
So under the contracts, who is charged with enforcing the standards, and it's you? I mean, who has the authority contractually to enforce these standards and see that they're maintained?
Senator, in the case of the Air Force Civil Engineering Center has a contract manager. The Housing Management Office actually has a dual chain of command to both the base commander and to the Air Force Civil Engineering Center.
Mm-hmm. Senator, we have the same structure with CNIC, but to go back to what Senator King said, you need one throat to throttle, and that's the service secretaries. The structure that you'll hear about is that the government is a passive partner in this, but passive partner does not mean getting involved in standards and enforcing what we have. We have the agreement, now enforce the agreement and the standards, and that can be done at our level on down.
Mm-hmm. Senator, there's supposed to be an overarching RCI partner entity doing oversight. I think it's insufficient. At the Army garrison level, it would be, of course, our garrison command through its Department of Public Works doing that, and we need to staff back up and get more aggressive on that. One of the things we are proposing is for example, 100% inspection of all life, health, and safety work orders, 100% presence in all transitions when somebody moves in or moves out of a home, and then spot checking pretty aggressively all other work orders. And then again, I'd be remiss if I didn't add in the chain of command has a responsibility to check in on their soldiers as well if they're having problems with work orders, customer service, you name it.
Mm-hmm. The Tenant Bill of Rights that you've each of you has mentioned now a number of times, do you anticipate incorporating that Bill of Rights into these contracts with the service providers so that they're contractually enforceable?
Yes.
Yes, Senator, that's exactly what we're talking about. This is a draft, but we want to fine tune it to make sure it has the teeth, and that teeth relies in the contract agreement.
Yes, sir. I think we need to operationalize each part of it into the individual home agreement between the provider and the resident, and we also need to look at operationalizing key parts of it into the incentive fee structure and everything else, so that we're hitting it at multiple levels and enforcing it that way.
Going back to a second to your oversight and thinking about the garrison staff, and we've seen reports that there's been significant cuts in the number of civilian employees who actually look at these installations, run the installations. In some cases, I've heard as much as 90%. So that even if you do have the contractual, you're telling me now you have the contractual authority to inspect these properties, but it sounds as if there may have been nobody around to actually do it. Is that accurate? And what are you going to do about it?
Senator, this is one of the observations that we've made, and one of the things we might be doing is coming back to you all for the direct hire authority to increase staffing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir. It looks like over a period of time, beginning around 2010, 2012, we began making reductions. We're anywhere from 1 person to 10 people. We didn't go to 0 anywhere, as best I can tell, but we did make reductions, and we're now looking at how do we staff back up to ensure we can do adequate quality insurance and quality control based on some of the ideas I shared with you earlier.
Senator, we have a similar kind of situation. One of the bases that I went to was one that was rated as performing well. And when you have a contract housing office where the contractor is performing well, we probably have enough people in that housing office to do the work. But when performance starts to slide, that's when it becomes overtaxed. So how we put the people back in to give support to the base commanders where it's really needed is I think, going to be the key decision point.
Let me go back for a moment to the contractual arrangements. How do you anticipate changing or altering these contracts in order to ensure that the private providers are appropriately incentivized and penalized when necessary for maintaining adequate housing, for responding in real time to complaints, and generally doing what they're supposed to be doing? I mean, how is this? I mean, look, let's just cut to the chase here. I'm a lawyer. We can talk all you want about ideals and aspirations and bills of rights. If you don't make them enforceable, if you don't put them in contracts, if there isn't real bite behind them, it's not going to go anywhere. And we'll be right back here 5 years from now with people saying that I know what the Bill of Rights are. There's nobody who I can go to enforce it. There's nowhere to get it done. We don't want to do that. So what are you going to do to make it enforceable so that we're not back here doing this again in a few years? Go ahead, Secretary Wilson.
Senator, I'm not a lawyer, but I do understand the incentives and how they're not set up properly. I think that the answer to this is to get less quantitative about these incentives, because those can always be gamed. We need to put authority with the base commander so that that local contractor knows that the base commander can say, no, that work isn't good enough, and it can impact their bottom line.
Senator, I look forward to having the negotiations with the private partner venture partners to see how we can come to a solution that provides us what we need for the product that we required to be delivered. I can't give you exact levers right now, but like I said, in the whole Bill of Rights, it will not work. It'll be a puff piece unless we link that into the agreements, whether at the local lease level or at the operating level.
I completely agree with my colleagues on this matter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all of you being here, and I appreciate your attention to this issue and obviously very serious attention to the issue that you're taking. But I think it's important for us to step back and take a personal look at how this is actually impacting an individual and a family. And I want to recognize that there are 2 folks in the audience here today from both Michiganders. Rachel Kilpatrick, who's a soldier stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. She's here with her husband, Calvin. And I had the honor of meeting with them, talking in depth about kind of the troubles that they went through, really kind of a nightmare that they went through in relation to their home. In fact, their home at Fort Bragg has been recently deemed unlivable. I think they were living in a home that was deemed unlivable. It's pretty outrageous. It was infested with termites. It had a severe outbreak of black mold, which caused significant health issues for her family. You're not going to be able to see this, but I'm sure you've seen some of these pictures. I'm sure General Millie, Secretary Esper, you've seen some of this when you visited Fort Bragg. Thank you for being there. But for the others, you know, this is a picture of their home. I'll describe it. There's just black mold all through the wood here in the frames, along the floor, along this beam. It's pretty despicable as to where they were living. And it's no wonder that they've had some significant health impacts, particularly with Calvin talking about respiratory issues related to that. And what gets me as I see this, and then I hear from contractors who say that, well, maybe we should adjust the BAH formula to provide more money for this. And then this is a public picture that was out. This is the landlord for this property, who has a 100-acre estate. I think this is his dining room. This is a pretty nice dining room for the landlord. Probably can't see that, but that's pretty amazing picture. So it doesn't sound like he's hurting too much, although he thinks maybe I can't maintain this property while I dine with my friends at this incredible mansion on 100 acres. It brings back visions of the term landlord back in the medieval days, where the landlords lived like this and other folks lived like this. Of course, these folks are soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, who are serving our country and serving it with honor. This is simply unacceptable for us to treat this way. Her husband, Calvin, is an example of someone who's now suffering from some health issues, from respiratory issues. He told me this morning that what he wanted to do was join the Army, that his wife was they were going to have children, he would join the Army. But now, because of respiratory issues that may actually be a result of living in this condition, he won't be able to join the Army and serve his country, something that he wants to do. So as we move forward, and all of you have made a great commitment of moving forward, what are we going to do about the people who are suffering from health issues as a result of living in these conditions in the past? Let's not forget what has already happened as we look forward. If you could tell me, how do we hold these landlords accountable for health issues? This is a process that supposedly was going to save taxpayer money, but now we have people in TRICARE and other health. We've heard instances where children may have been impacted as a result of living in these kinds of facilities. What are we going to do? We'll start with Secretary Esper, each of the secretaries. What are we going to do to go back to make sure those who were harmed in the past, that we hold these landlords accountable for what they did to some of our wonderful service members? Secretary Esper.
Well, Senator, thank you, first of all, for sharing that. I want to thank the family for coming forward. And much as I did in all the families I've spoken to, the chief and I and the spouses we met, again, wholeheartedly apologize that they have to live in such despicable conditions. It is unconscionable that that would happen. And it's troubling, the story you convey. First of all, the first concern obviously is to the health of the soldier and the family members. And we've talked to our doctors about this. I visited Womack and spoke about this when I was at Womack Hospital at Fort Bragg. And of course, I encourage them to immediately see their primary care provider. And if there's not getting any attention, we'll meet with them immediately after this hearing and make sure we get them connected to the right people, specialists as need be. And then I think you're right, over the long run, one of the things the Army is doing is making sure we can track the houses and make sure we know who's lived in those houses year over year over year. And certainly, of course, track the medical status of our soldiers and their dependents and make sure we understand if there are any relationships over the long haul. And then I think we need to pursue aggressively, if there's accountability, if there's something that was caused by act of negligence of the private contractor, to hold them liable. But at the end of the day, the Army is going to take care of its own. We're going to make sure that we take care of their needs medically and health-wise.
But the important point is you will hold these landlords accountable.
Absolutely. I think they're the first recourse. Is they had a responsibility to maintain quality homes. And in that case, clearly, the homes I saw that Senator Tillis joined me with down at Fort Bragg, they were not doing that. And in other places that the chief and I and other members of the chain of command are doing, they are not maintaining the quality that they are responsible for.
Thank you. Secretary Spencer.
Senator, I reverberate what Secretary Esper just said. And first of all, we have one of the best health care systems around for our sailors, soldiers, Marines, airmen, guardsmen, and their families. That's number one, is their health. Number two is doing what you're talking about doing, which hold accountability. The agreements, the master operating agreements, have the requirement for the product they have to deliver. They will be held to that standard in the contract.
Thank you. Secretary Wilson.
With respect to the health issues, the most important thing for a member who thinks their health has been affected is to go to the military treatment facility and get evaluated and treated and have it documented. Each of our bases have legal assistance to help family members identify what their options are and to be able to work those through with respect to a claim towards this provider. But it raises another issue, and I'll defer to the Chief on this.
Yes, Senator, central to your question, too, is what Chairman Inhofe brought up in the beginning, which is when did we know and how did we know it? And how did we not see the breakdown in trust that was occurring? And what are we doing about it to make sure that can't happen again? So what we're putting in place is there are 5 methods of what I call avenues of alarm, right? When there's safety or security, the issues like you bring up, that has to generate command team action and follow-up. The first one is you go to your housing management office, which is your first line of defense at the base, your advocate. That's got to trigger action and follow-up. The second is you go to your command team, first sergeant or commander. That's got to trigger action and follow-up. The third is you go to your medical provider and say, I think I have a health concern about my children and it's associated with my home. That can't stop within the medical community. It's got to get to the command chain and trigger an alarm. The fourth method is if I visited a Navy family who's living on an Air Force base, and I was concerned with that they were told, well, you're Navy, so you have to go through Navy chain. Not on our bases. If they're on an Air Force base, they're ours. And we're going to take care of them within the Air Force chain, and I know my teammates feel the same way about airmen on their bases. And the final is a 24-hour hotline that they can call, and if none of those top 4 work, they call the hotline. This morning, unknown to anybody in my staff, I called it and checked in to make sure that it is up and operating and that the checklists are there. It's up and operating. We have some work to do on it. But those avenues of alarm have got to get to the command chain and leadership so we can follow up and take action.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank everybody for coming forward today, and Secretary Spencer. I think you painted it quite appropriately that, you're glad to be here, but you wish you weren't here. This is a topic that we shouldn't be addressing in today's age. I was a young military spouse many, many years ago, married to an NCO, and we had similar issues. They are not nearly as bad as what we have seen from our families. I remember living in Indian Head at Fort Benning, Georgia, and the roaches were horrible. So bad that my husband and I did have to move into another set of quarters. They couldn't get rid of them, but we had to do it at our own expense. I thought that would have been alleviated 20, 25 years later. Obviously, it hasn't. Now, early 2000, living on Eglin Air Force Base. Army unit, belonged to Fort Benning, but we were living on Eglin. And the mold problems in Florida, horrible. The guys living in our barracks out there on the Ranger camp, subjected to holes in the walls. You could see daylight. It took a lot of arguing between the service branches to get that taken care of. This shouldn't happen, folks. We really owe it to our service members to do better for them and their families. And I'm thankful that you understand that. I'm just sorry that it took their situations coming to this level to be taken care of when it could have been taken care of at a much lower level in a more expedient manner. So I'm glad we have the opportunity to straighten this out. My fear is that we'll raise the issue, we'll have these discussions, but we won't see the necessary follow-through. So do we have a timeline? I'd like to hear from all of you. We've talked about the Tenant Bill of Rights. We've talked about other types of actions that can be taken. But what is our timeline moving forward? When can we expect to see this? When will those corrective actions be taken for our families? Secretary Esper, can you start, please?
Thank you, Senator, for your comments and your service as well. I think we look at this generally in terms of immediate, mid, and near term. The immediate challenge right now is to knock down all the life, health, and safety work orders. That's happening right now on all 49 Army installations. Get those resolved, and then take care of the other work orders as well. And then I think in the midterm, what we need to do is, at least with regard to the Army, staff up quality assurance, quality control, We need to make sure that we have adequate, independent, objective reporting systems on our Army bases to make sure we understand soldier satisfaction with the customer service being provided and a few other things there. And then in the long term, we really need to, and I think this will happen over the coming weeks, we need to finalize the Bill of Rights, looking for input from Congress, and then begin negotiating that and the leases and all the other pieces of that we discussed today to make sure we get it contractually bound for the long term. And then there are other longer term issues, re-educating our garrison commanders, our chain of command. The bottom line is this problem didn't come up overnight. It evolved over years, and I think it's going to take some time to get it finally resolved and in place and intact and maintain the close supervision so it doesn't fall back off the radar screen.
Mm-hmm. And, Secretary, do we have a timeline? What do you envision? What do you think is realistic? What can we tell our military families when this will be implemented? Bottom line, Tenant Bill of Rights.
Right. I want to believe we'll finalize the Bill of Rights here in the next few weeks with your input, and then begin discussing with the contractors. The chief and I have already had some discussions with them, generally in favor in terms of principles we outlined 2 weeks ago. But then I think it's the hard work that Senator Hawley talked about, is getting the lawyers and making sure we change all the agreements. So I would hope that we'd be able to do this in a few short months to make sure it's all in place and lined up, and then we're working against these new standards. We're working against contractual obligations. We have our chains of command in place with the right people at the garrisons to make sure that we do the proper oversight.
Secretary Spencer.
Senator, if you just cruise the web and look for communities, whether states or right here in the District of Columbia, their Bill of Rights for tenants, almost every single case I looked at, each item in the Bill of Rights was backed with a code. That's what we have to do in that light, is to put the teeth in the agreement that references the terms that we're giving them. I agree with Secretary Esper. I want to make sure that we get this in its fundamental basis through your all's input, families' input, et cetera, and then sit down with the private partner ventures. I will tell you, just to manage expectations, some of the things we'll ask for will probably take bondholder concurrence. So there are parties that have to be addressed here. I would say 90 days is what I'd be looking at, just in my eyeball of it.
Okay, thank you. Secretary Wilson.
Senator, I completely concur with my colleagues on this.
Okay, I appreciate that very much. Now, I thought it was really interesting, Senator Peters, bringing up the landlords. Truly different situation centuries ago, but it begs the question. We know that the garrison commander typically makes the determination each quarter on the percentage of the quarterly incentive or bonus payment that the private partner landlord receives. What is that average percentage that those landlords are receiving, that private partner? Do we know what that is, and can that be presented here today, Secretary Esper? Secretary Wilson, did you?
Senator, I was just going to say, we have 32 different agreements, so it's 32 different contractors. 2 of those 32 have no incentive fees. 13 of 32 don't have the garrison commander or the base commander evaluation. 17 of 32 do have a base commander evaluation component, and where we have it, it's generally between 5 and 10% of the total fee that's influenced by the base commander, and we don't think that's sufficient.
Okay, thank you.
I interpret the question differently, Senator, in that what are we actually paying in incentive fees? We do ours at the regional level, which is, here's an example of what we're rethinking, which is to deliver the ability to award the incentive at the base level. But in our levels, we're somewhere around 75 to 80% of incentives paid. And it should be noted that those incentives that aren't paid stay in the system and go into the sustainment fund, the reserve fund, just as a note.
And then and my time has expired, I apologize. And then I'm assuming that reserve fund is held in trust, or is that used to?
That is reserve. It is held in trust with an agreement on how it is used for capitalization.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Ernst.
Senator, I know we'll get you that information as well.
Thank you, Secretary.
Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So before the previous hearing, I sent out letters to all 5 of the private housing companies that testified 2 weeks ago to get some more data and background information on what was going on. They have since provided my office with the requested documents that I'd asked for in this letter. And representatives from 3 of those companies have met with my staff to explain how their business model works. The companies summarized 600-page, complex, secret financial agreements into a single PowerPoint slide that clearly laid out how they actually don't make much money and they only receive their fees after setting aside money for operating and maintenance expenses. Meanwhile, they also claimed that because people don't have to live on base, they are properly incentivized to provide excellent service. If you believe the companies, it all makes sense on paper. The market works perfectly. They said, in effect, there's no problem. The incentives are all working. The market works. Nothing to see here. So let me just start by asking Secretaries Spencer, Esper, and Wilson, do you agree that the housing market for base housing is working properly? Would you like to start? Secretary Esper?
Senator, clearly it's not working.
It's clearly not working.
I mean,
right?
we have too many problems. It's evidenced by what's coming out in our town halls and what this committee heard from the families sitting behind us. It's not working.
So we don't have any doubt about that. Secretary Spencer, you agree?
Totally agree.
And Secretary Wilson?
Agree.
All right. So the market isn't working as intended. We have to ask the question why it isn't working intended. And the basic idea behind what it takes for a market to work is there have to be rules and there has to be someone who's willing to enforce the rules. Last week, the Army personnel chief told us in a military personnel subcommittee that the terrible conditions in which military families have been living are a leadership failure, plain and simple. Do you all agree with that assessment, Secretary Esper?
Yes, ma'am. I think the chain of command over the past 20 years has slowly walked away from being involved in the housing of our soldiers and their families. Yes.
And everyone else agrees with this? I'll get you on the
That's
record
true.
there.
Senator, I think that there's more than that. I think that the financial incentives as they are structured do not incentivize the right behavior.
Okay, so you're saying you think both the contracts are bad, but let's just start with the enforcement part of this is also a problem, and that's a leadership problem. Is that right?
Yes.
Just want to make sure we're in the same place on this.
Leadership both in the military side and also the local leadership of the contractor.
Okay, but it's leadership on the military side that enforces. It's not the contractor that enforces.
One of enforcement, that is true, but we have where I would say that where we don't have problems at bases, local leadership and management quality really matter. And that is the biggest indicator of quality housing, is a good local manager by the housing contractor.
Fair enough, Secretary Wilson, but I just really have to bear down on this point. If no one will enforce the rules, then I understand exactly how incentives work. And the way incentives work is to improve your profits by not delivering the product that you promised to deliver. So we've got to look at both of these, the leadership on how we get enforcement of the rules and whether the rules themselves are adequate. And I take it from what you've already said, we have a leadership problem, but we also have a problem on the rules. Correct, Secretary Esper?
Yes, ma'am. I do want to make a good point, something the chief reminded me of, because we need to be fair to the chain of command here, too. There was an instruction given by civilian leadership in the 2013-ish or time frame to say you are not responsible, that you should not conduct inspections of the homes. And so we've subsequently unwound that and are now giving different guidance to the chain of command to be involved.
Okay, but who gave those orders? I mean, we can talk leadership. Let's just move up a little. Somebody issued those orders, and it didn't come from the contractor.
An assistant secretary at the time did.
An assistant secretary of the Department of
the Army.
The Army.
Yes, ma'am.
Said don't enforce the contracts, in effect.
No, it said do not, you're not responsible for conducting inspections of the housing.
But who was going to enforce the contracts?
Well, we completely agree, Senator.
All right. Okay. So there's the problem we've got. We need better rules, and we need better enforcement of those rules. I'm putting together a reform bill that will enhance oversight, protect tenants. I know we're working on a tenant Bill of Rights here. You know, the committee can put all of the right rules in place that it wants, But if the leadership doesn't enforce those rules, then at the end of the day, we're not going to be delivering for our military personnel. Enforcement, not just signing the contract, but enforcing the contract is absolutely critical. So I just want to dig down on one part of that and on some reports of potential fraud. The committee has received reports from military families who are being charged for things like carpet replacement upon moving out, but the carpets are not actually replaced. Do the services conduct any inspections when the houses are in between tenants to make sure that the providers are actually completing the work that they're charging the military families for? Do we know the answer to that, Secretary Esper?
I can't tell you right now, Senator, but I'll get you the answer. But I've heard the same thing, and I think going forward, one of the things I said earlier today is we want to have 100% quality control on any transition, moving in or moving out, because we've heard similar reports.
If someone's going to have to pay for it. Secretary Spencer, did you want to add to that?
It is technically, Senator, the housing office, the local housing office. Again, oversight, whether they do it or not, is now front and center.
Okay, so they have the authority to do it, they're just not doing it. And Secretary Wilson, did you want to add anything to that?
Senator, we do about a 10% sampling, so it is not a 100% look at the turnover time. I also would like to say that we take all indications.
I'm sorry, you do 10% sampling. What have you found in your 10% sampling?
I'd have to get you the data.
Okay, whether this is a problem or not. Okay, and what kind of follow-up you do if you find out there's a problem?
If there is an indication of fraud, we take that seriously and turn it over to the investigators for fraud.
Okay. I appreciate that, but I'll just say it again. Until we get some real enforcement on these rules, we can write all the rules we want here in Congress, but we got to rely on you folks to make sure they actually get enforced. Thank you.
Thank you,
Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Warren. Senator McSally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Senator Warren, this may be one of the few areas that you and I are in strong agreement with each other, and I look forward to working with you on it. And thanks for the leadership all for coming here today on this really important issue, and for the families who are represented here, some of which testified a few weeks ago. We've been talking a lot about landlords, but honestly, based on hearing their harrowing stories, some of these sound like they're slumlords, not landlords. And I can think about, we've been talking a lot about the commander. I can't imagine being a commander and having someone in my unit whose family is dealing with these types of situations where their kids are sick, they end up, live in a hotel, not knowing day to day where they're going to be sleeping the next night with them and their children and their families, and the uncertainty and the lack of responsiveness and the impact that has, not just on the welfare of those individuals, but on the readiness of that unit and the ability for them to be able to do their warfighting mission. This is ultimately a commander responsibility. And you mentioned, Secretary Esper, how some guidance in the past somehow moved in that direction. I think it's probably that way in most of the services. A few years ago, we had an incident with energy bills pop up at one of the bases in Arizona. And when I started looking into it, I talked to the local commander, and there was this feeling of like, that's between the tenants and the landlord, and that's a contract that they have. We got to get away from this. I think we all agree that we got to get away from this, and we've got to move back into the commanders having responsibility, having the ability to enforce, having the ability to withhold payments, and make sure that the health and the well-being of our members and their families are taken into account. It seems like right now the commanders, and to a varying degree, are either totally out of the loop at some bases or somehow involved slightly at some bases. So it's very patchwork, it sounds like, from the testimony today. I also am concerned from some of the testimony from a few weeks ago that we're hearing even today the first line of advocacy is the housing office. In many cases, these families testified the housing office felt there was a feeling that they were kind of in cahoots with the contractors, and there was no real accountability or oversight. So since this has been raised, has there been any looking at what's going on in the housing offices and holding individuals accountable that maybe had these issues brought to their attention for some of these families, but they did nothing or they weren't responsive? Do you have any cases of that in all of the reviews that have gone on in the last few months? And has anybody been held accountable in these housing offices? Because they're not their advocates, according to the families. Can I get an amen? Amen. Yes, ma'am.
what we did find in the housing offices was insufficient numbers of people and insufficient support, and likewise from the Civil Engineering Center, insufficient technical assistance from civil engineers when it's required. I think with respect to your point on commander responsibility, you are absolutely spot on. And it is, a commander needs to be able to assess. That means they have to have access, and some commanders were being told by contractors that they couldn't bring in their environmental health folks and take a look at a home. That's unacceptable. They need to be able to direct that a repair is not sufficient. They need the adequate support in their housing offices and civil engineering squadrons. They need to be able to withhold payment, and they need to be able to impact the fees that are paid. And if a commander has that kind of authority, I am pretty confident that they'll start to get responsiveness.
And to follow up on that, Secretary Wilson, what do you need in order to allow them to have that authority? Does that take an act of Congress, or is that all happening at the service level?
I don't think we need an act of Congress for that. I do think we are going to have to change some of the contracts, and we may need a bit of backstopping from the committee as we go through those negotiations.
Okay. Secretary Spencer?
I couldn't underscore that better. We need your backstop as we go into negotiations. With them knowing that you're behind us, I think we have a bully pulpit to start the negotiations with.
Thank you.
I agree as well, Senator.
Great, thank you. The other issue that came up in the hearing was, and it's been mentioned a little bit today, is families having to have extraordinary out-of-pocket expenses, some related specifically to fixing their own problems that the private companies should have done, some related to medical bills. Are you also tracking, or is there a new mechanism for tracking out-of-pocket expenses of families, and what mechanisms they need for them to be reimbursed from the failures of this?
Senator, they should not be paying out-of-pocket expenses for something that is a responsibility of the private contractor. I have heard those stories as well. Again, it's reprehensible that has happened. So that's why in the Bill of Rights we've changed some things. For example, no longer will we accept non-refundable pet fees, I think is one thing. And there are other fees out there as well we need to address. And likewise, in terms of when somebody PCSs and they move in or move out of a house, having a third-party Army person there on the spot to arbitrate any issues so that they just don't arbitrarily keep their BAH, claiming that there's excessive damage to the home.
I wouldn't want to, Senator, hang all solutions on a new shiny object, but in the leg that I was talking about, communications, whether it be an app, whether it be whatever, having a record of communications is stage one. So one, we can track it, and two, advocates and or appropriate offices and people of responsibility are on record that this is an issue.
Okay, thank you. Secretary Wilson, anything to add?
No, Senator, I think my colleagues have covered those pretty well.
Okay, great. I am almost out of time, but I do want to just go back with a follow-up on my last statement of, I really think you guys need to look at the housing offices and the housing advocates and what their role has or has not been, not just technical issues or manning, but again, the stories and the testimonies we had for specific individuals in those cases, not everybody, but what's happened, even if they're undermanned, but them not playing their proper role and not actually being the advocate for the families. Thanks.
Thank you. Senator McSally, Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for following up on this issue and all the military families who are here today. And I want to thank General Milley for visiting with me yesterday and really giving me a very candid and determined view of the extent and magnitude and complexity of this issue. And like the panel today, he was reasoned and deliberate, but I sensed in his view what I hope you share, which is a sense of outrage and anger that we've come to this point. Now, I'm just a country lawyer from Connecticut, but I was a prosecutor for a good part of my career. And what I've seen about landlords and about others who may break the law is that they understand money, particularly withholding of money, and they understand prosecution. There have been references here to fraud. I think there are clear indications of fraud I would be even more emphatic given another setting. But I would recommend that these issues be referred to the United States Department of Justice for investigation. What's happened here is criminal. It may not be criminal in the sense of provable beyond a reasonable doubt in a courtroom against a specific company or individual. I'll leave that to the Department of Justice. But I would respectfully recommend that each of your services ask the Department of Justice to be involved in an immediate, intensive review of whether a criminal investigation is appropriate or a civil investigation. Because that's the enforcement that these landlords will understand. They are landlords. They may be slumlords, but they've counted on this cash cow. It is a risk-free cash cow. Very few landlords in the country have tenants who are obligated to pay for decades, literally decades, without any real accountability. That's been their situation up to the present. So I'd like to ask each of the service secretaries who are here today, would you consider asking the United States Department of Justice to be involved?
Senator, yes, sir. I think we should pursue any allegation of fraud and hold people accountable if that's the case. And we'll certainly take this back to our lawyers and make sure we approach it the right way and aggressively.
Senator, we're already underway with naval audit. And as you know, the way the system works, once naval audit has the data, then DOJ would be involved.
Senator, for the Air Force, it's the Office of Special Investigations that does the initial investigation and then refers matters to the U.S. Attorney in the district where it's involved. And we take allegations of fraud very seriously. And I'd be happy to talk to you about that more privately.
I'd be happy to talk to each of you privately, but let me just point out that the procedures for audit and internal investigation, in fact, take a lot of time. And I would, again, very respectfully suggest that this procedure ought to be expedited. And as a former United States Attorney, I can tell you, I would respect your going directly to Main Justice with this issue, either the Civil Division or the Criminal Division. And if we really care about this issue, let's recognize it for what it is and provide you with that backstop. Because at the end of the day, what they will respect across the table from you, and it won't be you, it will be people down the chain of command talking for you and representing you, but what they will respect is the hammer of fair and effective law enforcement behind you. And I think if this problem had just arisen, if it were new or novel, maybe following the normal audit procedure would make sense. But we're dealing here with a problem that has festered for a long time. I think that's been the overwhelming testimony here today. And I appreciate your being willing to talk to me and perhaps others of the committee about an immediate referral to the Department of Justice. And I say I'm going to be formalizing that request in a letter that I hope to send to you within the very near future. I want to ask about the health impacts. I heard from a woman, military family who lived in housing in New London at the sub-base there from April 2014 to August 2018. She explained that the Balfour BD maintenance officer was responsive to some of her maintenance requests, like clogged drains. When she reported mold in their bathtub, they were advised just keep washing and cleaning the mold after every shower. Her youngest child caught pneumonia and shortly afterwards suffered a stroke. only a week before her first birthday. She acknowledges she'll never be able to determine whether the stroke was caused by the mold in the apartment. But I'm asking now about the health effects, particularly on children, and whether you have been in touch with the VA, because some of these individuals may no longer be involved in active military service, to determine whether these environmental hazards and toxic substances encountered during military service can be compensable and treatable under the VA health system. I'll go down the line again, beginning with you, Mr.
Yeah, before we go down the line, we are going to adhere to our time limit, so I would deny that at this time and recognize Senator Tillis.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to take those answers in writing and adhere to the time.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Tillis happens to be, in addition to a good member of this committee, the chairman of the Personnel Subcommittee, so he deals with these issues on a daily basis. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all. We had a Judiciary Committee markup, and I had one other commitment. Otherwise, I would have been here to hear your testimony. And I'm only going to probably ask one question. I want to start, though, by thanking Secretary Esper. He was down at Fort Bragg. I was with him on Friday. We got an opportunity to visit two houses, the Bloods and the Blankenships. We got to meet little Jason, a little 18-month-old that's living in unacceptable housing conditions. We heard stories from a very empowered wife, Miss Blood, who is standing up for other people who I think are a little bit intimidated and were afraid to come forward. I frankly believe that we've somehow drifted with a program that started out well in 1996, worked well for a while, but now we're in the wrong place. I, for one, am not prepared to simply place blame on any link in the chain, though, because my guess is the housing providers are at fault, the command is at fault, the department is at fault, and Congress is at fault for taking their eye off this ball. The one thing that I tell everybody when I get before a committee hearing, if you're in North Carolina and you're living in a house that has military housing that has unacceptable conditions, if you haven't gotten the right reaction from your command, call my office. It'll be casework, and I'll guarantee you it'll move to the top of the stack. I also want to thank General Milley for coming in and talking about the plans, and Secretary Spencer for the phone call that we had, and I know I'll have discussions with all of you over time. But we've got, I'm not going to let go of this for the remaining Congress. We will have another oversight hearing with the chairman's blessing to see where the progress is. And I'm not talking about next year. I'm talking on fairly short intervals, because if you look at this, this is not rocket science. We can fix this, and it starts by doing what every branch has said they're going to do. They're going to go out and knock on every door and request permission to come in and see things that they think are unacceptable. Many of them will be okay. Some of them won't. All of them need to be identified. I do want to ask a question, and it's probably less of a question, but more of a commitment from you all. It's been brought to my attention that some of the housing providers go to these young people. I mean, these are young, it may be the first lease they've ever signed. And they go to these big organizations. Some of the ones are smaller, and these big organizations waive a non-disclosure agreement in front of them and say, if you sign this non-disclosure agreement, there may be actually some sort of a bonus or a payment that you will be entitled to if you don't bring up what may be inadequate housing. That's at least how I read it. I don't know if y'all are aware of this, but here's what I'd like to find out if we can do immediately. Rescind every damn one of these that have been signed. Because it looks to me, and I don't mean to be cynical, but this is a practice by the housing providers. They better come up with a damn good reason for having somebody sign on to this, because I've been a landlord before. It would have never occurred to me to say, I want you to sign away your right to say you're living in inadequate conditions. I don't know if that makes sense to any of y'all. I'm not going to ask you to go down the line, because God forbid you say it does. Because I can't imagine on any level why it would make sense to have a new tenant, these young kids, asked to sign this agreement, not understand the implications of it. So in my view, if any of these agreements are in force, I expect them to be rescinded over the next 30 days. And over the next 30 days, if they're not rescinded, I want to know what housing company wants to come before me and tell me why it makes sense. Tell me the business reason why it makes sense. Tell me the reason why it's for the good of the tenant. I'd love to have that conversation. We'll have it in an open hearing. We'll have it in my office. But I'll guarantee you, this has got to stop. Again, all of you have responded the way I would expect you to as the great leaders that you are. We have drifted. I can't imagine that any of you would have knowingly allowed the conditions that we've seen actually persist. But now I expect every one of you to be on the tip of the spear to fix it. And everybody in command better be in touch with their folks that they've been entrusted to take care of. They better fix it. And they better applaud people who are coming forward in these communities and stepping up and being the ones that are saying, this is wrong. This is not the way we treat our men and women in uniform. And I know you all agree with this, but this has got to be on short intervals. This isn't something we come back to next year and say, how have you done over the last year? We will have meetings in my office. We will have as many hearings as the chair will allow me to have. I want to see end to end where you're making progress, and I want to see short interval timelines. But over the next 30 days, I want to see every damn one of these canceled unless you want to walk into my office with the housing provider that thinks it's a good idea and build a case for me removing myself or changing that position. So thank you all for being here. And the last thing I would ask every member of the Senate to do, if you've got a military installation anywhere in your state, go visit them. I'm going to go knock on a few doors down at Camp Lejeune and down at Fort Bragg. I'm not going to do it announced. I'm going to walk on a door, and I'm going to do exactly what you guys are doing. I'm going to knock on the door and say, can I come in and take a look around? And it better be trending in the right direction. Because you all know I've got a history of supporting you. I've got a lot of confidence in every one of you. I know you can fix this problem, but this has to be a top priority. And these folks better make sure, the housing providers better make sure that unacceptable business practices, I don't know how to do your jobs in terms of waging war, but I know how to run a business. This kind of business practice actually sets off a series of thoughts in my mind that make me wonder just how far these businesses have drifted. And we're going to find them. And the ones that haven't addressed this before I find them, there's going to be a consequence. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for your commitment to taking care of our men and women in uniform.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Senator Hirono.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for being here because to have all of our services represented in this way emphasizes the importance of this issue and your commitment to resolving the problems. I do want to thank you, Secretary Esper, for coming to see me yesterday, and Secretary Spencer, I'll be discussing with you some matters later on today. Thank you for your responsiveness. Now, as I sat here listening to all of you and the questions, it is really astounding that some of the additional revelations. For example, I want to thank Senator Tillis for raising the issue of these non-disclosure contracts. Let's go down the line. Is this news to all of our secretaries, Secretary Esper?
I think the first time I heard about it was in a meeting that Senator Tillis and I had with some spouses at Fort Bragg, and it just, I don't understand it. I've never heard of it before in my life. I've rented my share of apartments, so we definitely got to dig into this. There's no reason why people should be signing NDAs.
Secretary Spencer?
Exactly.
News to you, Secretary Wilson.
Senator, in my visits to bases, I did not come across anyone who told me about one of those, but we're going to go back and check.
Thank you, because I think that is simply astonishing that tenants would be forced to sign these kinds of documents, and it may be one of the reasons that we hear from the tenants that there's a fear of reprisal if they even say anything. So I would very much appreciate, I share Senator Tillis's concern about these kinds of so-called contracts. I do want to thank you, Secretary Wilson, for pointing out to us, and I was very taken with your acknowledgement of the loss of trust of the airmen and women, that their housing concerns will be addressed and fixed. Is that a concern that is acknowledged by the other secretaries, the loss of trust of the service members?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
So what would be, I'll start with you, Secretary Wilson, what would be the first thing that you would do that would directly go to your service member to tell them that you are going to listen to them and that you are going to fix their concerns relating to housing?
Senator, one of the things that the Chief and I are going to be doing over the next week or possibly 2 weeks is to send out a clarifying guidance from us of what we expect from commanders and first shirts all the way up through the chain of command, what their responsibilities and obligations are. I think you rebuild trust by doing what you say you're going to do and being responsive and holding people accountable. And so I don't think it's something that can be done with one communication
Yes,
or one
I realize
action.
that. This is why I asked, what is the first thing that you're going to communicate
The
to
first
your
is
service?
the first is communication directly to the chain of command on what we expect.
And what the chain of command gets, is that going to get to your service members so that they know your chain of command is not going to have other expectations as to how they should behave?
Yes, ma'am, we will be broadcasting that very widely.
Secretary Spencer?
Senator, right after the initial hearing, the CNO issued the NAV admin letter, which laid out exactly what we're doing going forward. The Commandant wrote the white letter. This is part of our knocking on every door for a visit to be completed by April 15th. And there's a second avenue to that, and this is also the trust that's been lost with the private partner venture provider. Now, the ball is in their court, but that is something that all us three service secretaries are coordinating through not only the Bill of Rights, but through communication and education.
Secretary Esper.
Senator, it's a combination of communications, and we issued an execution order, if you will, within days of visiting Fort Meade to talk about what our expectations are of the chain of command. We've sustained those communications. I think the visits by the leadership, both uniformed and civilian, are critical, but now we've got to do the hard work of renegotiating contracts, implementing this Bill of Rights, and then have that sustained attention to this issue.
If I were a tenant, the first thing that might impact me as to the seriousness that you all take the issue of housing would be a piece of paper that has the Bill of Rights as a tenant. So I want to ask you, when is the timing for the Bill of Rights, which will be across all service?
The three of us took a first cut at the draft. You all are reviewing it now. We addressed it a little earlier in that I would say to manage expectation, probably 90 days. And you might ask, why so long? We're going to sit down with the private public venture partners to make sure we can put the teeth, to ensure we put the teeth in the agreement. And in some cases, this might actually get bondholders involved and third parties involved. So I just want to manage expectations that it might take 90 days up to.
Sure, because we'd like to get it right. As you're formulating the Bill of Rights, though, are you contacting, or are you is a group like the Family Military Association Network, for example, are they being engaged in helping to formulate the Bill of Rights?
I don't know exactly of that organization. I know my office was reaching out to similar representatives of the military families living in houses.
I think it would be very important to have the military families' voices be heard as you develop the Tenants' Bill of Rights. And then there's been a lot of focus on the enforcement aspect of it, and I just want to reiterate how important that element is. And so I hope that you're going to put in place some very specific ways that enforcement will occur, and that your tenants will know what they need to do to kick off the kind of enforcement that we would expect from each of you. Secretary Esper, you noted, and I want to thank you, that you visited Schofield Barracks. When was that?
That was last summer, Senator.
So you talked specifically with them about their housing issues?
I can't recall at the time whether we did. I think what you may be referencing is earlier this last year in October, we were at a family conference, the Chief of Staff and the Sergeant Major and I, and an issue came up about Schofield Barracks with regard to a particular home at which we immediately dispatched a team to go look into the problem and remediate it.
So, Secretary Wilson, thank you. I think that with all of this, the communications that will occur about housing, you're going to hear more about these issues as you visit the bases, and I think it's really important for all the secretaries, in particular, to see firsthand. Secretary Wilson, you mentioned that as you're developing a way for people to withhold their rents, but if the rents go directly to the housing agencies or entities, how are you going to fix that with regard to withholding of rent?
Senator, there's a couple of different ways that we're looking at, and this is one of the things that gets into the implementation of the Bill of Rights. But one of the ideas is an escrow account that's decided at the local level, so that it's not a big administrative hassle to be able to get your rent back if you have reported a problem and it hasn't been taken care of.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Let me make one last comment here. I want to be sure everyone understands, this isn't going to be the last hearing that we're going to have. Senator Reid and I have talked about this. In fact, the next one we've already had with residents, we've had with government, but we haven't had a hearing with the contractors, and that would be next. So for the purpose of this meeting, I'm going to ask Senator Tillis, the chairman of the Personnel Subcommittee, to chair the remainder of the meeting. Senator Tillis. Now it goes to Shaheen.
Senator Shaheen.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here. I want to begin first to make sure I understood, because I came in the middle of Senator Tillis's questioning, but he was suggesting that everybody go out and personally visit some of the housing on bases that are under your control. Is that an intent of everyone here to do that?
Yes, ma'am, it is. I've visited a few bases the Chief of Staff has, the Vice Chief of Staff has, the Undersecretary has, and of course, undergoing right now is a 100% inspection of all of our housing units that'll be complete in about another week and a half or so.
Same with Navy, Senator. Been out to 3 of the Hampton Roads communities, Lejeune, Cherry Point. The rest of the office is also on the West Coast, down the Gulf. We are out there visiting. I know the Commandant and the CNO are also underway.
And you're doing the 100% of all of the housing?
By April 15th, yes, ma'am.
Senator, in my case, I personally went to Tinker, McDill, and Shaw. The chief went to Maxwell and Keesler. We also did a directed review of all military family housing that was finished by the 1st of March, and that the results of that, the initial results of that review are in the record.
Senator, if I could just clarify for the Marine Corps.
Please.
I mean, these people, we can't invade the privacy of their property without their permission. So what our commanders have been directed to do is to ask the member, both on and off base, if they lease their property, not a homeowner, if we can visit them. If they refuse, which is their prerogative, we would ask that we could interview them over the phone about the condition of their property. If they refuse that, then we'll try to provide information like, do you have these phone numbers? Here's the process. If you have an issue, or if you've got a problem with your landlord, tell me what the problem is. We'll engage with the landlord. So that's kind of where we are. So it's going to take some time. And we've got, just like everyone at the table, we've got members that live on other services bases, because we do schools together, and we have education together, and we have joint bases together. So it's going to take some time to scope this out, although I believe we all recognize, based on today in the hearing, that we've known there were problems. This is not, but we thought it was more isolated. I don't think we had an idea of the magnitude, so we'll have to scope and scale that to get back to you in the next hearing.
Senator, just to give you a sense of that, we have a very similar program to the Marine Corps as you would expect. To date, we've done, on our way to 100% contact, we have 62,000 people contacted. Of those 62,000, about 900 have agreed to have visits done to their homes, and those visits are in progress. So it gives you a sense of the scale involved.
Thank you. I want to go back to a report that came out before many of you were in your positions, but in 2015, the Pentagon's Inspector General conducted a series of military housing inspections to determine if facilities were in compliance with DOD. And what that report found was that there were significant deficiencies in homes at 5 different bases, including dwellings that were built or renovated under the MHPI program. Have any of you seen that Inspector General's report, or are you aware of it? Is there anybody on the panel who has seen it and is aware of it?
I'm not aware of it, Senator.
I've gone back and looked at a few reports. I don't know if I've seen that exact one, but there was a DOD one. I think there was a GAO one. I've looked through 3 or 4 reports, Senator.
General Milley?
I'm aware of it. It came out in the summer of 2015. I became the chief in August. A couple months afterwards, I've looked through it, and appropriate agencies within the Army have been working on it. We give you full status on it. Our Army IG tracked all of the actions and all the deficiencies, and they've been working on it for a while. So it's clear it was not a good report. It was in the negative, and there's a lot of work yet to be done. I think Secretary Esper, Secretary Spencer, one of them said, this entire issue is the cumulative effect of a decade or almost 20 years of multiple problems. This is not going to be solved in 60 days, 90 days, a single Bill of Rights. This is going to be a concerted effort, multiple hearings, over time. This is going to take a considerable level of effort by all of us at this table, the Congress, and all the chains of command and the contractors to get after this thing. It's going to take a sustained level of effort.
I certainly appreciate that. I think everybody who's hearing about this issue understands that it's taken us a long time to get here, so it's going to take us a while to get out. I guess the question that I've got is, when we've got an IG report like that raises the issue, it's then surprising to me to hear so many people who appear to be unaware of the extent of the problem. And so I'm just trying to figure out how we make sure that information from an IG report like this gets carried over from one generation of leaders to the next so that it continues to be addressed. You spoke to the fact that the Army is continuing to address what was in that report. Is that something that, again, if people are unaware of it, clearly you haven't done anything to address it, but how do we make sure that this kind of a report gets shared and addressed as leadership changes?
Senator, in the case of the Air Force, we track all open IG recommendations monthly, and we have corrective action plans on every open IG recommendation. Our standard now in the Air Force is that there must be a corrective action plan for any DoD IG finding within 30 days, and that our objective is that 90% of them be closed within 12 months of the finding. We were aware of some systemic problems, particularly related to construction quality and a lot of the impact of water and moisture and mold and so on at 4 of our bases that were very significant, and the construction on those continues.
Senator, same for Navy. While I said I was unaware of the study, we have the same tracking system. And if, in fact, they had not been remediated, they would have been flagged. That's why I said I wasn't aware of it, but we didn't have any open issues in the system.
Well, I guess, again, that's why I'm puzzled. How do we flag this kind of an issue in the future so that it doesn't get to this point? I was struck, and I appreciated the opportunity to visit with you, Secretary Esper. I was struck with your comments about your concern that people in the military didn't feel like they could come to the military leadership and raise these concerns until it got so bad. And so I know that everybody's wrestling with this, but it seems to me we need to try and figure out how to make sure that it doesn't have to be a crisis or an article that appears in the newspaper before we're aware and begin to address it.
Yes, Senator, as I've met and spoken with spouses and soldiers, I think that's maybe one of their biggest concerns is what's the long-term sustained effort to make sure that this doesn't fall off our radar screens. And that's why we're all putting forward a number of ideas to make sure we have the systems in place, that the chain of command is in place, that we get the culture back to where it was, where we're checking in on soldiers and families wherever they live.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
I mean, Senator, if I might add, the Army has a best practice there with the outsourced lodging. You've done a terrific job in that regard, and the checks and balances and single points are there. So we can pay attention from even models in our own system.
Thank you.
Well, now that I've had a chance to count to 10, I'm going to be a little bit more as we close out the hearing. First off, Senator Shaheen, I don't know if Secretary Wilson was able to answer your question about the inspection, but I think that the Air Force is also reaching out and making sure they're all given an opportunity. And it's not that they're barging in every home. If someone says that they don't want their home inspected, then the presumption is they're satisfied with it, and many of them are, to the point that Admiral Richardson made about the number of contacts versus the number of inspections. I would assume that they have a challenge that they want to look at, but
we try and characterize them also, Senator, as visits, really, not as formal inspections.
Right. That's actually why I wanted to make sure that the families know they're not coming in for some sort of home inspection. But I appreciate the outreach, but it's just these mechanical things that drive me crazy. When you hear a And in one of the cases, when we were down at Fort Bragg, someone saying that they do this survey to figure out where they are, what the satisfaction level is. So they have this annual event, come in, maybe win a $500 certificate. There's this pressure to have a positive predisposition. Why? Because these housing providers want a good score so that they get a bonus allocation. So the negative sort of the cynic in me says the only reason that you would ask somebody to sign on to a non-disclosure is you want to juice the system so that you get a better review. Maybe I'm wrong. Happy to talk with a housing provider who thinks that practice needs to stay in place. But Secretary Esper and I, we were in this garage at the Blood's house. Now, these are people that have been in this house for 4 years. Now, they're near a range, so the ground shakes, nails are going to pop, general maintenance is going to occur. I understand all that. And as long as the maintenance requests are fulfilled over a reasonable period of time. But we went into the garage underneath, I don't know if it was the bathroom, I think, Secretary.
Yes, sir, it was underneath it was a bathroom leak.
So I was the first one to crawl in and kind of look at the ceiling that had been patched. I used to do drywall work when I was a teenager, and this thing was patched 2 days before. It doesn't take 48 hours for even a thick patch of drywall to dry. It was wet. I went up there and stuck my finger in it, and then the secretary did the same thing afterwards. What happens here? Well, we've got this process where the tenant calls and says, I got what looks like to be a leak. The plumber comes, obviously didn't do their job, followed by the drywall people who had to have known that the patch wasn't fixed. The drywall was wet, but they did their job by patching the drywall. And I'm sure that drywall repairman reported, pay me because I did my job, but that person should have had the authority to say, it's not right for me to do my job now because the precursor to this work hasn't been solved. That's what I mean in terms of the supply chain. And General Milley, I agree.
Senator, just to kind of add more color to the story, because you recall this, what she told us as well is, when she originally called the work order in, what they told her was, just hang around your house for 3 days, and we'll come sometime during the 3 days.
Right. So we give you a window. The norm
a 72-hour window while she has a job to go to.
Right. So, I thought that Secretary Esper was dead on. I mean, we should be treating this engagement with the tenants the way you engage an Uber driver. Just after the experience with the plumber, give them stars for whether or not they fix the problem. With the drywall person. In other words, let that be the feedstock for determining whether or not these housing providers are doing their job and providing adequate service. That's the sort of modernization that we need to focus on. And General Milley, I completely agree. It's going to take time for us to make sure that we have the operational pieces in place not to drift. I believe that as y'all go through this process, some direction either from this administration or past administrations may have increased or decreased the priority on housing. Let's bring that to the fore. Any congressional action that caused a negative impact, we're not going to find any one person responsible. We're all responsible probably, and we're all going to be responsible for the fix. But the one exception I would take, General Milley and I think only have one exception, and it's his favorite football team. That's the only thing I've found over time that I can't get him to turn around on. But on this issue, I do take exception to the notion that this is going to take a long time to fix for those who are in acceptable housing now. I don't think that's what you meant. So there's two pieces. Number one, fix every single one of them now. I think some of these housing providers are hoping that the problem kind of goes away because people get PCS and they'll wait for the next person to raise the same issue again. So let's separate the systemic, the operational changes that we need to make that will take some time from the immediate challenge to make sure every single person who's in unacceptable housing either gets it up to standard or gets them in another home. And I'll do it. I'm sorry, Jim.
That's correct. If it's life, health, safety, it's immediate. But the systemic problems, of which there are many, the restructuring of these contracts, the incentive fees, going to the Department of Justice, all these other things that we're talking about, the structural issues, that's going to take a considerable length of time and a lot of gnashing back and forth between Congress and the department and the contractors and lawyers and so on and so forth. But the immediate life, health, safety, that's immediate. That's chain of command. We've got to be all over it. And I believe, by the way, that the contractors that we've talked to, the 7 contractors, I believe they're committed to those immediate fixes for life, health, safety.
And I do too. And then finally, again, this issue with the non-disclosure, General, go ahead.
Yes, sir. I wanted to just talk to that non-disclosure a minute. You know, Senator Cotton allowed us to speak directly to airmen. There's another group out there that I think we can't close this hearing without speaking directly to, and that's parents of airmen. And as a parent of an airman, you know, every Friday afternoon, we have 800 young men and women, greatest treasure in our nation's arsenal, walk across the parade field at Lackland Air Force Base, and they become airmen. And at the end of that ceremony, the parents rush out of the stands, and they entrust them to us. And I'm imagine there's a lot of parents of airmen who are listening to this hearing and wondering whether the leadership of the United States Air Force is taking care of their airmen or future parents. And I don't want to leave this hearing without looking at them in the eye and tell them that we own this and we will take care of their children.
And I'm sure the thing could be said straight down the line. So I want to work with you all. I am serious about if maybe this non-disclosure. I also want to tamp down red herrings. If this non-disclosure practice no longer exists, this is just an artifact, that's great. If there's any one housing provider that thinks that they have a rational basis for not rescinding these non-disclosure agreements over the next 30 days, I want to see them in my office. And I want to get to these, what I think are big these big rocks that we can turn over fairly quickly so that we can really size the problem and address the problem. Secretary Spencer, and then we'll close out.
Senator, I will tell you right now that this afternoon I will call all of our CEOs the PPV, and I have to believe they're probably watching this testimony right now. And if they have any of these documents in their files, they're to be accounted for, and we're going to talk about them this afternoon.
Thank you. And again, if they think they have a rational basis for it, I want them to come in my office and explain it to me. Thank you all. You know, every single one of you, I've had the privilege to vote for and support in your current positions. I have the utmost confidence in you. I know that you're going to go after this. I know that it's complicated, and you should know that I will do everything I can to help you get to a good place as quickly as possible. So with that, we will end the hearing. I think we will keep the record open for a week, and I'll also pass it over to Senator Reid before we close out.
I just simply want to thank all the witnesses, not only for your testimony, but for your commitment to fix the immediate problems and then stay on target for months and months and months as we fix the systemic problems. Thank you.
Again, thank you all. We will keep the record open for any questions for the record, and please know that my office is here to help you. Thank you. The meeting's adjourned.